Picture this, you're not some TikTok celebrity chef, but a nameless, faceless kid, maybe 10, maybe 12 years old. Skinny as a rake, probably covered in mud more often than not, and definitely shorter than pretty much everyone. Your name? Well, it doesn't really matter, does it? You're just one more mouth to feed, in a world overflowing with mouths and rarely enough food. The year? Let's say it's somewhere around 1350. The place? A sprawling, imposing castle, the kind that dominates the landscape and sucks up all the surrounding resources like a hungry tick. This castle, much like any other in that time, is a world unto itself, and you're about to be thrown headfirst into its belly, specifically its steaming, chaotic kitchen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably heard tales, whispered in hushed tones in your tiny village, about the castle, about the lord and lady, their opulent feasts, and the seemingly endless supply of, well, everything. Maybe you even imagined yourself as a knight, bravely defending those towering walls. The reality, though, is a lot less glamorous and a whole lot more practical. Your family, struggling to keep afloat after a particularly harsh winter, has managed to secure you a position, of sorts, in the castle kitchen. Not a glorious position, mind you. Not even remotely close. You're a scullion. Now, a scullion, in the grand hierarchy of the medieval kitchen, is basically the bottom of the food chain, lower than the guy who sweeps the floor probably. Your job description, in its simplest form, is to do all the dirty, unpleasant, and back-breaking tasks that no one else wants to touch. Think peeling mountains of vegetables, scrubbing pots until your fingers bleed, fetching water from the well in the dead of winter, and generally being at the beck and call of every other member of the kitchen staff. Exciting, right? Your first day, or rather, your first dawn in the castle kitchen, is a rude awakening. The sun hasn't even thought about peeking over the horizon, but the kitchen is already a hive of activity. Torches flicker, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and something vaguely rotten. You'll get used to that last one, eventually. The head cook, a burly man with a perpetually greasy apron and a booming voice that could shatter glass, barely acknowledges your existence. He just points to a gigantic pile of turnips, bigger than you are, and grunts, "Get to it, whelp, and don't let me catch you dawdling." Dawdling is not an option. You quickly learn that speed and efficiency are valued above all else in this kitchen. Every minute wasted is a minute less time for the cooks to prepare the Lord's meals, and a minute closer to a potential beating or worse, being sent back to your village in disgrace. So you grab a dull paring knife and start hacking away at the turnips. The skin is tough, your hands are clumsy, and before long, you've managed to slice your finger. A small bead of blood wells up, mingling with the dirt and grime already coating your skin. You barely flinch. Pain is just another part of the job. Hours blur together. The kitchen fills with more and more people, each with their own specific tasks. There's the spit turner, a young boy even smaller than you, condemned to rotating a massive roast over the roaring fire for what seems like an eternity. There's the baker, a grumpy old woman who seems to communicate solely through glares and the occasional well-aimed toss of a flowery towel. And then there are the higher-ranking cooks, each barking orders and wielding knives with a terrifying level of expertise. You quickly realize that the kitchen is a strict hierarchy. Each person has their place, and woe betide anyone who steps out of line. The head cook is the king, of course, his word law. Beneath him are the master cooks, each responsible for specific dishes or sections of the kitchen. Then come the journeymen, skilled cooks working their way up the ranks. And finally, at the very bottom, there's you, the scullion, the turnip peeler, the pot scrubber. Your duties are relentless. After the turnips, it's on to cleaning the pots. These aren't your modern non-stick pans. These are heavy cast iron cauldrons, blackened with years of use and encrusted with burnt food. Scrubbing them requires brute force, a wire brush, and a seemingly endless supply of sand. Your arms ache, your back protests, and your fingers are raw, but you keep scrubbing. The head cook is watching, and his glare is enough to keep you going. The heat in the kitchen is oppressive. The ovens roar, the fires blaze, and the air shimmers with rising heat. Sweat pours down your face, stinging your eyes. You're constantly dodging hot coals, splashing water, and the occasional flying object, usually a discarded bone or a particularly offensive vegetable. It's a dangerous place, the medieval kitchen. Burns are commonplace, cuts are inevitable, and accidents happen frequently. You see one poor lad stumble and fall into a vat of boiling water. He screams, a horrifying, high-pitched sound that sends shivers down your spine. He's pulled out quickly, but the damage is done. He'll be lucky to survive. As the day wears on, you start to understand the rhythms of the kitchen, the ebb and flow of activity, the constant cycle of preparation, cooking, and cleaning. It's a relentless, unforgiving process, but it's also strangely satisfying. There's a certain sense of accomplishment that comes from transforming a pile of raw ingredients into a delicious meal, even if you're just a small cog in the machine. You also start to learn the unwritten rules of the kitchen. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact with the higher-ranking cooks. And never ever touch anything that doesn't belong to you. The kitchen is a place of scarcity, and theft is rampant. Everyone is looking for an edge, a way to supplement their meager rations. You see cooks pilfering scraps of meat, bakers sneaking away with extra bread, and even the head cook helping himself to the Lord's wine. It's a dangerous game, but a necessary one. By the end of your first day, you're exhausted. Every muscle in your body aches. Your hands are covered in cuts and burns, and you smell like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and turnips. You're given a crust of stale bread and a bowl of watery soup for your dinner. It's barely enough to keep you going, but you eat it gratefully. You're too tired to complain. You're shown to your sleeping quarters, a cramped, dark corner in the kitchen itself. You're given a thin straw mattress and a scratchy blanket. It's not comfortable, but it's shelter. You collapse onto the mattress, too tired to even think. As you drift off to sleep, you can still hear the sounds of the kitchen, the crackling fire, the clatter of pots, the murmur of voices. The kitchen never truly sleeps. It's a constant churning engine, always preparing for the next meal, the next feast, the next demand from the lord and lady. You're just a scullion, a small, insignificant part of this vast and complex machine, but you're here now, and you'll learn to survive. You'll learn to peel the turnips, scrub the pots, and navigate the treacherous hierarchy of the medieval kitchen. You'll learn to endure the pain, the heat, and the endless demands. You'll learn to be useful, and maybe, just maybe someday, you'll even learn to cook. But for now, you're just a nameless, faceless kid, covered in mud and grime, trying to make your way in a world that doesn't care about your name. And that, in itself, is a beginning. A humble beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. Alright, let's settle in and really get to the heart of what life was actually like for a medieval castle cook, shall we? Forget the fancy feasts for a moment. We're talking about the daily grind, the relentless, back-breaking, sun-up-to-sundown labor that defined their existence. Imagine waking before dawn, long before even the lord and lady of the castle stir. The castle kitchen is already a hive of activity, a dim, smoky space illuminated by flickering torchlight and the growing glow of the ovens. Your first task, stoking those fires. Now these aren't your modern gas or electric ovens, folks. We're talking massive brick or stone structures, some big enough to roast an entire ox, and they need a lot of fuel. Think cords and cords of wood hauled in from the surrounding forests. You're not just tossing in a few logs, You're feeding a furnace that needs to maintain a consistent intense heat for hours on end. This means constantly shoveling wood, adjusting the airflow, and monitoring the temperature. If the fire dies down, the entire day's baking or roasting could be ruined. It's a sweaty, grimy job, the heat radiating outwards, even in the dead of winter. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood clinging to your clothes and skin. And you're doing this every single day, often with minimal breaks. There's no zoning out, no checking your phone. This fire demands your constant attention. Once the fires are roaring, the real prep work begins. Remember, there's no popping down to the local supermarket for pre-chopped vegetables or ready-made dough. Everything is made from scratch, using the most basic of tools. Let's talk about the water situation, for instance. Clean water isn't always easy to come by. It has to be drawn from wells, rivers, or even rainwater cisterns, then carried in buckets to the kitchen. Think about the sheer volume of water needed for cooking, cleaning, and washing ingredients. It's heavy, tiring work, especially for the younger scullions or the older, less able members of the kitchen staff. Then there are the vegetables. We're talking root vegetables primarily. Things like turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions. These need to be scrubbed clean, often covered in mud and grime, then peeled, chopped, and diced, all by hand, with a basic knife. Imagine doing that with bushels and bushels of vegetables every single day. It's repetitive, hard on the hands, and incredibly time-consuming. And the meat? Well, that's a whole other story. If you're lucky, the castle has its own butchery, but even then, the kitchen staff is often involved in preparing the meat for cooking. This could mean plucking feathers from birds, scaling fish, or even helping to butcher larger animals like pigs or sheep. It's a messy, often unpleasant task, requiring strength and a strong stomach. The smells alone can be overpowering, especially in the warmer months. Grains, too, require significant preparation. Wheat and barley are the staples, and they need to be ground into flour for bread, porridge, and other dishes. This is often done using a hand-operated quernstone, a heavy circular stone that's rotated to grind the grain. It's slow, arduous work, requiring a constant rhythmic motion. Larger castles might have a watermill or windmill to automate the process, but even then, someone still needs to manage the milling process and transport the grain. And let's not forget the herbs and spices. While the Lord's table might boast exotic spices from far-off lands, the everyday cook relies on more readily available herbs. These need to be gathered, dried, and ground, often using a mortar and pestle. Again, it's a manual process, requiring time and effort. Throughout all of this, the kitchen is a constant flurry of activity. Pots bubbling over the fire, knives flashing, cooks shouting orders, scullions scurrying about. It's a chaotic, high-pressure environment, with little room for error. The hours blur together, the work never really stopping. There's breakfast to prepare, then lunch, then the evening meal. And in between, there's always something to be done. Cleaning, chopping, stirring, tasting, adjusting. There's barely a moment to catch your breath. And then there are the ovens. We talked about stoking them, but that's just the beginning. You need to know how to control the heat, how to place the food inside, and how long to cook it for. There are no thermometers or timers, just your experience and intuition. The ovens are unforgiving, too much heat, and the food burns to a crisp. Too little, and it's undercooked and inedible. And unlike modern ovens, the heat isn't evenly distributed. You need to rotate the food regularly to ensure it cooks evenly. This means reaching into the scorching hot oven, often with just a simple wooden paddle. Burns and scalds are a common hazard of the job, and it's not just about the cooking itself. The ovens also need to be cleaned regularly. Think scraping away burnt food and ash, often while the oven is still hot. It's a filthy, unpleasant task, but essential for maintaining the oven's efficiency. As the day wears on, the exhaustion starts to set in. Your muscles ache, your back is sore, and your eyes are burning from the smoke. But there's no time to rest. The Lord and Lady and their guests expect to be fed, and if the food isn't up to par, there will be consequences. Finally, as the sun begins to set, the last meal is prepared and the kitchen starts to wind down. But even then, the work isn't over. There's still cleaning to be done, pots and pans to be scrubbed, floors to be swept, and work surfaces to be wiped down. It's a final grueling effort after a long day. And even as you collapse into your meager bed, exhausted and covered in grime, you know that you'll be doing it all again tomorrow. It's a life of relentless labor, of constant physical demands, and of unforgiving ovens. But it's also a life of purpose, of providing sustenance to the castle community, and of playing a vital role in the medieval world. A sleepy thought as you drift off awaiting the new dawn. Okay, let's settle in and talk about something that might seem a little, well, organized for a medieval kitchen. But trust me, it was essential: the hierarchy. Think of it like a very greasy ladder where everyone knew their place, and trying to climb too fast could lead to some pretty unpleasant consequences. At the very bottom, bless their hearts, were the scullions. We talked about them before. The absolute workhorses. They did all the really nasty jobs, washing dishes in freezing water, scrubbing floors until they shone, or at least until the master cook thought they shone, fetching water from the well, basically anything no one else wanted to do. Their days were long, their pay was practically non-existent, and their prospects, well, let's just say they weren't exactly aiming for Michelin stars. Most of the people there were children. Young teens at the newest. Above the scullions came the kitchen boys. These guys had earned a tiny bit of responsibility. Maybe they were allowed to chop vegetables, pluck feathers from birds, or stir the perpetually simmering pot of something. They were still doing a lot of grunt work, but they were starting to learn the basics of cooking. This was their apprenticeship, their chance to prove they had what it took to move up. Some of them might have shown some level of culinary creativity, and they got to work at this. Then we had the cooks, the backbone of the kitchen. They were responsible for specific tasks: roasting meats, baking bread, preparing sauces. These were skilled workers, and they took pride in their craft. A good cook knew their ingredients, understood the ovens, and could whip up a decent meal, even when supplies were running low. They'd often have junior cooks and kitchen boys helping them in turn. They had their own specialties, and it's often these that they passed on to apprentices that had shown potential. Above the cooks were the specialized roles. You might have a sauce chef, a pastry chef for the Lord's table, or something like a butcher or a brewer attached to the kitchen, but on their own tier. It depended on the size of the castle, but those people reported directly to the master cook, and had often worked in the kitchen for years beforehand. They were the masters of their very specific domain, and had the recipes and techniques locked into their memories, so you had to be careful to stay on their good side. And finally, at the top of the ladder, we have the master cook, the boss, the head honcho, the one who ruled the kitchen with an iron fist, or more likely, a very large spoon. The master cook was responsible for everything: planning the meals, ordering supplies, managing the staff, and ensuring that the Lord and his guests were well fed. This was a position of power and influence. A good master cook could make or break a castle's reputation. Now, this hierarchy wasn't just about who got to boss whom around. It was about control, efficiency, and, to some extent, safety. Everyone had their assigned tasks, and everyone knew who to report to. This helped to keep the chaos of a busy kitchen at least somewhat manageable. It also meant that experienced cooks were teaching apprentices, passing on their knowledge and skills to the next generation. Of course, this strict structure also had its downsides. There was little room for creativity or innovation. Questioning the master cook was generally frowned upon, and if you were stuck at the bottom of the ladder, it could be very difficult to climb your way up. But the hierarchy wasn't the only thing you had to navigate in a medieval kitchen. There were also the hazards, and trust me, there were plenty. Imagine a room filled with open fires, boiling liquids, sharp knives, and heavy pots, all crammed into a small space with people rushing around. It was a recipe for disaster, quite literally. Burns were probably the most common injury. Open fires were used constantly, for everything from cooking to heating water, and these weren't your modern controlled flames. These were roaring infernos that could easily singe your eyebrows, scorch your skin, or set your clothes on fire. Spilled pots of boiling water, fat or soup were another major hazard. A splash of scalding liquid could cause serious burns, and if you weren't careful, you could end up with permanent scars. Cuts were another occupational hazard. Knives were used for everything, and they were often kept razor sharp. A moment of carelessness could result in a deep gash, and in a time before antibiotics, even a small cut could become infected and lead to serious illness. The cooks had to be really careful to sharpen their knives and not their fingers. Then there were the falls. Kitchen floors were often slippery with grease, water, and spilled food. Tripping over a stray pot or slipping on a patch of oil could lead to a nasty fall. And with all the heavy equipment lying around, a fall could easily result in a broken bone or a concussion. Things really got bad when the stone floors were slick with ice melt coming in off of people's boots. But the hazards weren't just limited to burns, cuts, and falls. There were also the dangers of smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion, and back strain. The kitchens could get incredibly hot, especially in the summer, and with the fires constantly burning, the air could be thick with smoke. Breathing in all that smoke and heat could lead to respiratory problems, dizziness, and even unconsciousness. And lifting heavy pots and carrying sacks of flour all day long could take a serious toll on your back. The constant heat could leave people exhausted, so they had to take plenty of breaks when they were able to. So how did medieval cooks avoid these hazards? Well, for starters, they wore thick clothing to protect themselves from burns and cuts. Aprons, gloves, and head coverings were essential. They also learned to be very careful and deliberate in their movements. Rushing around was a good way to get hurt. They also developed a keen awareness of their surroundings. They knew where the fires were, where the knives were, and where the slippery spots were. They also learned to work together, to warn each other of potential dangers. And finally, they relied on experience. The more time you spent in the kitchen, the better you became at avoiding accidents. You learned to anticipate problems, to react quickly, and to protect yourself from harm. Despite all these precautions, accidents still happened. Burns, cuts, and falls were a part of daily life in the medieval kitchen. But the cooks were a tough bunch. They knew the risks, and they accepted them as part of the job. They patched themselves up, dusted themselves off, and got back to work. Of course, not everyone was so lucky. Some injuries were too severe to treat, and some infections were too strong to fight. But even in the face of danger and hardship, the cooks of the medieval kitchen kept working. They had a job to do, and they weren't going to let a few burns, cuts, or falls stand in their way. They were the unsung heroes of the castle, the ones who kept everyone fed and happy, even in the face of incredible challenges. And for that, they deserve our respect. All right, settle in, friend. Things are about to get a bit more refined. We've seen the daily grind, the scullion's plight, and the sheer volume of food needed to keep a castle running. But now we're heading to the Lord's table. This isn't about quantity, it's about quality, presentation, and meeting some rather lofty expectations. Imagine the pressure. You're not just feeding hungry bellies anymore, you're crafting an experience. This is a performance, a statement of wealth, power, and let's be honest, a little bit of one-upmanship. Every dish is a reflection of the Lord's status, and by extension your skill. Mess this up, and you might be looking for a new job, or worse. The ingredients themselves take on a whole new level of importance. Forget the rough-hewn vegetables and hunks of salted pork we were wrestling with before. Now we're talking about the freshest, most vibrant produce, often sourced from the Lord's own gardens, or purchased at a premium from local farmers. Think perfectly ripe peaches, carefully selected herbs, and game birds hunted with specific instructions on their preparation. And meat, Oh, the meat. We're not just tossing a joint of beef onto the spit anymore. We're talking about roasted swan, peacocks meticulously re-feathered after cooking to look as stunning as they did alive, and elaborate pies filled with layers of different game meats. These aren't just meals, they're edible sculptures, designed to impress as much as they are to nourish. Technique becomes paramount. Remember that basic roasting skill we talked about. Now you need to master it, achieving perfectly crisp skin on a bird, ensuring the meat is cooked evenly throughout, and creating a flavorful, aromatic stuffing. These are all essential, and don't even think about serving anything undercooked. The Lord's palate is far too discerning for that. Sauces are elevated to an art form. No more simple gravies thickened with flour. Now we're creating complex reductions, infused with spices, herbs, and even wine, all carefully balanced to complement the dish perfectly. These sauces aren't just additions, they're integral to the overall flavor profile, adding depth and complexity to every bite. Presentation, of course, is key. Forget the haphazard plating of the common hall. At the Lord's table, every dish is a work of art. Food is arranged meticulously on platters, garnished with edible flowers and herbs, and presented with a flourish. This is about creating a visual feast, stimulating the appetite and showcasing the skill and artistry of the kitchen staff. And speaking of artistry, let's talk about pastry. Baking for the Lord's table is a whole different ballgame. We're not just churning out basic bread and pies anymore. We're talking about elaborate creations, intricate designs, and flavors that are both subtle and unforgettable. Think towering pies filled with spiced fruits, delicate tarts topped with candied violets, and breads shaped into fantastical creatures. The pressure to innovate is ever present. The Lord and his guests have likely seen and tasted it all. So you need to be constantly experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and coming up with new and exciting dishes. This means staying on top of the latest culinary trends, learning from other cooks, and let's be honest, taking a few risks along the way. But it's not just about individual dishes, it's about the overall flow of the meal. Each course needs to complement the others, creating a harmonious progression of flavors and textures. The meal needs to be balanced, with lighter dishes followed by richer ones, and savory courses interspersed with sweet. The goal is to create a culinary journey that is both satisfying and memorable. Then there's the service. You, as head cook or someone closely involved, aren't directly serving the food, but you are orchestrating the entire process, ensuring the food is delivered hot and fresh to the table, that the serving staff are properly trained and attentive, and that the Lord's every whim is catered to. A well-oiled kitchen isn't enough. You need a well-oiled dining experience. Dietary restrictions and preferences also come into play. The Lord might have certain foods he dislikes, or perhaps he's observing a religious fast. You need to be aware of these requirements and adjust the menu accordingly. Catering to individual needs is a sign of respect and attention to detail, and it's crucial for maintaining the Lord's satisfaction. Beyond the technical skills, you need to understand the politics of the Lord's table. Who are the important guests? What are their likes and dislikes? What kind of impression does the Lord want to make? These are all factors that can influence your menu and your approach to cooking. And finally, remember your place. You are a servant, albeit a highly skilled one. The Lord's table is not your platform for self-expression. It's a reflection of his power and status. Your job is to execute his vision, to create a meal that pleases him and his guests, and to do so with humility and grace. So yes, preparing food for the Lord's table is a step up from the scullery. It's a chance to showcase your skills, to learn new techniques, and to gain recognition for your talents. But it's also a high-pressure environment, with demanding expectations and potentially dire consequences for failure. It's a world of culinary artistry, political maneuvering, and constant striving for perfection. Are you ready for it? Because the Lord is waiting. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to peek behind the curtain of plenty and get a glimpse of the real challenges faced in keeping a medieval castle fed. We're talking pantry raid, scarcity, theft, and the informal economy of food. Now you might imagine a medieval castle as a place of endless feasting, rivers of wine, and mountains of meat. And to be fair, sometimes it was. But the truth is, even within those imposing walls, hunger was a frequent visitor. Keeping a castle stocked with food was a constant battle against spoilage, unpredictable harvests, and well, just plain old logistics. Imagine trying to feed hundreds of people, day in and day out, with no refrigerators, no freezers, and no supermarkets. Everything relied on what could be grown locally, preserved skillfully, or traded for, if you had something worth trading. And that's where the scarcity really starts to bite. Bad weather, crop failures, sieges, any of these could throw the castle's food supply into chaos. One season of poor harvest could empty the granaries alarmingly fast, and suddenly the menu looked a whole lot less appealing. Think more gruel, less roast boar. And it wasn't just about having enough food, it was about having the right food. The lord and his family had certain expectations, and woe betide the cook who couldn't deliver. But when the pantry shelves started looking bare, temptations arose. Enter the pilfering problem. Let's be honest, when you're working in a kitchen surrounded by food, and you know your own family is going hungry, the line between yours and mine can get a little blurry. A handful of flour here, a chunk of cheese there. It might seem like a small thing, but it added up. And it wasn't just the lowliest scullions who were tempted. Even cooks higher up the ladder might borrow ingredients, either to supplement their own rations or to line their own pockets. After all, a skilled cook who knew how to stretch ingredients could make a little extra profit on the side. The castle kitchens, you see, weren't just places of culinary creation. They were also hubs of informal, unofficial economies. And that's where our next ingredient comes into play: bartering. Now, wages in a medieval castle weren't exactly generous. Often a significant portion of a servant's compensation came in the form of food rations. But what if you didn't need all of your bread ration? Or maybe you were a skilled brewer with access to extra ale. That's where the unofficial bartering system came in. Within the castle walls, a lively market sprang up, fueled by necessity and opportunity. A blacksmith might trade his services for a cook's extra cheese ration. A stable hand might swap some firewood for a share of the baker's fresh bread. These exchanges weren't usually formal or regulated. It was more of a wink and a nod, a quiet understanding between individuals. And it wasn't always about food for goods or services. Sometimes it was food for favors. A little extra meat for the guard who turned a blind eye to a late-night rendezvous, perhaps. Or some fine pastries for the Lord's Chamberlain, in exchange for a little information. This informal economy was a vital safety net, helping people get what they needed when official channels failed. It allowed for a degree of flexibility and resilience in a system that was often rigid and unforgiving. It also fostered a sense of community, as people relied on each other to make ends meet. But it wasn't without its downsides. The bartering system could be easily exploited. Those in positions of power or with access to valuable goods could take advantage of those less fortunate. And of course, there was always the risk of getting caught. A cook caught pilfering could face severe punishment, from fines to public humiliation to, in extreme cases, dismissal, a disastrous outcome for anyone dependent on the castle for their livelihood. So the next time you picture a medieval castle, remember that it wasn't just a place of grand feasts and noble pursuits. It was also a complex, messy ecosystem where the pursuit of food, a basic human need, drove a hidden economy of scarcity, theft, and bartering. And it was a constant reminder that even within the most opulent settings, survival was never guaranteed. Alright, let's settle in and talk about something crucial to the medieval cook's life: the changing seasons. It's easy to forget, looking at our modern supermarkets overflowing year-round, that for most of human history what you ate depended entirely on the time of year. Imagine for a moment, life without refrigeration, without global shipping, without even reliable storage. Pretty bare cupboard, right? For our castle cook, this seasonal cycle wasn't just a matter of menu planning, it was a matter of survival. Summer, of course, was the season of abundance. Think of long, sun-drenched days ripening fruits and vegetables. The castle gardens would be bursting with life. Beans, peas, cabbages, onions, garlic, leeks, turnips, a veritable rainbow of fresh produce. Herbs too were at their peak. Thyme, rosemary, sage, parsley, all filling the air with their fragrant oils. The fields surrounding the castle would be golden with grain, ready for harvest, meaning fresh bread, pottage and ale were plentiful. And of course, summer was the best time for hunting. Game animals like deer, rabbit, and fowl were fat and healthy after a season of good eating, providing much-needed protein. The rivers and streams teemed with fish, easily caught and grilled or stewed. It was a time of feasting, of celebratory meals, of showing off the castle's wealth and the cook's skill. Think of the Lord's table laden with roasted meats, colourful salads, and sweet fruit tarts, all washed down with refreshing summer ale, or even a light wine, if they could get their hands on it. But summer couldn't last forever, could it? As autumn approached, the days grew shorter, and the cook's focus shifted to preservation. This was a frantic, busy time, a race against the coming winter. Because when the snow fell, the bounty disappeared. Think of the cellars and larders as empty as your tummy gets if you have to miss a meal or two. It's a difficult time. Every available method was employed to keep food from spoiling. Salting was a mainstay, especially for meats. Large cuts of beef or pork would be packed in layers of salt, drawn from the huge salt reserves that every castle needed to maintain. Smoking was another common technique, particularly for fish and smaller cuts of meat. Hams and sausages could hang in the smoky rafters of the kitchen for weeks, even months, slowly curing and taking on a rich, distinctive flavor. Pickling was essential for preserving vegetables. Cabbages became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and various other vegetables were submerged in vinegar or brine, a salty liquid. Drying was another critical method, especially for fruits and herbs. Apples, pears, and plums could be sliced and dried in the sun or in a slow oven, providing a sweet treat during the long winter months. Herbs were hung in bunches to dry, their fragrant leaves carefully stored for use in soups, stews, and medicines. But even with all these efforts, winter was a time of scarcity. The castle's menu became severely restricted. Fresh produce was almost non-existent, replaced by preserved vegetables and dried beans. Meat was limited to what had been salted or smoked, and even those supplies dwindled as the winter wore on. This was where the strictures of the church played a significant role. Lent, the period leading up to Easter, was a time of fasting, of abstaining from meat and other rich foods. This wasn't just a religious practice, it was a practical necessity. By the end of winter, the castle's food stores were running low, and fasting helped to stretch those supplies out. Dishes like pottage, a thick vegetable stew, became staples, flavored with whatever herbs and spices were available. Fish, often salted or dried, was another common food during Lent. Think of dull, grey meals, a far cry from the summer feasts. The cook had to be incredibly resourceful during the winter months, making the most of limited ingredients and relying on skill and ingenuity to create palatable meals. Spices, though expensive, became even more important, adding flavor and warmth to otherwise bland dishes. The baker, too, played a crucial role, providing the staple bread that kept everyone going. And let's not forget the importance of ale. Brewing was a constant activity in the castle, and ale provided not only hydration, but also much-needed calories and cheer during the cold, dark days. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the cycle began anew. The first signs of green shoots emerging from the earth were greeted with immense relief. Early spring vegetables like leeks and onions provided a welcome change from the winter diet. The first eggs of the year were a precious commodity, and the rivers began to teem with fish once more. The cook's creativity and resourcefulness were tested once again as they tried to stretch dwindling winter stores while incorporating the new, fresh ingredients of spring. It was a time of hope, of anticipation, of looking forward to the abundance of summer. And so the seasonal cycle dictated the life of the medieval castle cook. It was a life of hard work, of constant pressure, of feast and famine. But it was also a life deeply connected to the natural world, a life that required skill, ingenuity, and a profound understanding of food and its preservation. They were feeding not only the lord and his court, they were feeding the castle, keeping it going through the hard times and celebrating the good. All right, settle in, folks. Let's get cozy and talk about bread. Bread. In a medieval castle, it wasn't just some side dish, it was life, and the person responsible for keeping everyone in loaves and pies. The baker, a vital role, wouldn't you agree? So let's peek into the baker's domain. Now, the baker's life, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, or rather, sunshine and freshly baked crusts. It was hard work, really hard work. Imagine waking up before the sun even thinks about peeking over the horizon every single day. That's what the baker faced. The ovens needed to be preheated, and that took hours. We're talking about massive stone ovens that could hold enough bread to feed a small army, or well, a castle full of people. First things first, the grain. It wasn't like popping down to the local supermarket. The baker relied on the castle's stores, which in turn depended on the harvest. A good harvest meant plenty of grain, usually wheat or rye, and a happy baker. A bad harvest? Well, that meant smaller loaves, coarser bread, and a lot of grumbling from the castle inhabitants. Once the baker had the grain, it needed to be ground. Some castles had their own mills, powered by water or wind. Other times the baker had to rely on a local miller, and you can bet that miller took a cut. Milling was a whole process on its own, separating the wheat from the chaff and grinding it into flour. The quality of the flour directly impacted the final product, so a good miller was worth their weight in, well, flour. Okay, flour acquired. Now for the magic ingredient, yeast. Now you might be thinking, easy, just grab a packet from the fridge. Nope, medieval bakers didn't have access to convenient, commercially produced yeast. They had to make their own. And this, my friends, was an art. One common method was to use a starter, also called a leaven. This was a mixture of flour and water that was left to ferment naturally, capturing wild yeasts from the air. The baker would nurture this starter, feeding it regularly with fresh flour and water, keeping it alive and bubbly. It was like having a pet, a very hungry, very important pet. The starter gave the bread its characteristic flavor and texture, and each baker had their own secret for maintaining it. It was their signature. Another method involved using the dregs from brewing ale. Ale, you see, contained yeast, and the leftover sediment could be used to leaven bread. This gave the bread a slightly different flavor, often described as tangy or even slightly bitter. It was a good way to make use of leftover resources and save a bit of money. Now the dough, mixing the flour, water, yeast or starter, and sometimes a bit of salt, was back-breaking work. The baker would have to knead the dough by hand, pushing and folding, until it was smooth and elastic. This could take a good half an hour, maybe longer, depending on the amount of dough. Kneading developed the gluten in the flour, which gave the bread its structure. Insufficient kneading meant a dense, heavy loaf. Perfect kneading meant a light, airy one. Once the dough was kneaded, it needed to rise. This meant leaving it in a warm place to ferment, allowing the yeast to work its magic. The baker had to keep a close eye on the dough, watching it carefully as it doubled in size. Too little rising, and the bread would be dense; too much, and it would collapse. It was all about timing and experience. Okay, dough risen. Time to shape the loaves. The baker would divide the dough into portions, shaping them into rounds, ovals, or whatever shape was required. Some loaves were simple and rustic, while others were more decorative, perhaps scored with a knife or sprinkled with seeds. The shaped loaves were then left to rise again for a final proofing. Now the moment of truth, baking. The ovens were preheated to the right temperature, usually by burning wood. This was a skill in itself. Too hot, and the bread would burn on the outside before it was cooked through. Too cool, and it would be pale and doughy. The baker would use their experience and instinct to judge the temperature, often by throwing a handful of flour into the oven and watching how quickly it browned. The loaves were carefully placed in the oven, either directly on the hearth or in earthenware pots. The baking time depended on the size of the loaves and the temperature of the oven. The baker would check the bread regularly, using a long wooden peel to turn it and ensure even baking. Finally, the bread was ready. The baker would pull out the loaves, their crusts golden brown and fragrant. The smell alone was enough to make your mouth water. The bread was left to cool on racks before being distributed to the castle inhabitants. But bread wasn't the only thing that came out of the baker's oven. Pies were also a staple, both savory and sweet. Meat pies, filled with beef, pork or game, were a hearty meal. Vegetable pies packed with whatever was in season were a welcome change from the usual fare, and sweet pies, filled with fruit or custard, were a special treat. The pie crust was made from flour, fat, usually lard or butter, and water. It was rolled out and used to line a dish, filled with the desired ingredients, and then topped with another layer of crust. The pies were baked until the crust was golden brown and the filling was cooked through. They were a delicious and satisfying way to use up leftovers and create a variety of dishes. The baker's domain was more than just a place. It was the heart of the castle, providing essential sustenance and, let's be honest, a little bit of comfort too. The baker's skill and dedication ensured that everyone, from the lord to the lowliest servant, had enough to eat. It was a tough job, but a vital one. So next time you enjoy a slice of bread, take a moment to appreciate the hard work and artistry of the medieval baker. They truly were the unsung heroes of the castle. All right, settle in folks, because we're about to get our hands dirty. We're diving into the world of meat in the medieval castle kitchen. Now I know what you're thinking. Meat sounds simple enough, but trust me, it was anything but simple. This wasn't popping down to the local butcher for a neatly packaged cut. This was an experience. So picture this, it's early morning, perhaps not quite dawn yet, and the sounds of the castle are slowly waking. But in one corner of the bailey, near the stables, the real action is about to begin. Because today, we're slaughtering. Whether it's a pig, a sheep, maybe even an ox for a really big feast, the process was pretty much the same. Now, medieval folks weren't exactly sentimental about their livestock. It was a food source, plain and simple, but that doesn't mean the process was haphazard. There was a certain respect, shall we say, born of necessity. A clean, efficient kill meant better quality meat and less waste. And waste was a sin, both economically and morally. The actual killing blow was usually swift, aiming for the most humane and efficient result. Then came the butchering. This was where the real skill came in. Our castle cook, or more likely one of the experienced assistants, needed to know their anatomy inside and out. It was all about breaking down the carcass into usable portions, specific cuts for the lord's table, tougher bits for stews, scraps rendered for fat and tallow. Everything had a purpose. There were no fancy electric saws or specialized tools, just knives, axes, and a whole lot of elbow grease. It was a messy, smelly job, often done in the open air, come rain or shine. And let me tell you, hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority back then. You did what you could, but, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't want to think too hard about it. Once the butchering was done, the best cuts were hauled to the kitchen, and that's where the real magic began. Roasting was king. Think grand, open fireplaces, with spits turning slowly over the flames, whole sides of beef, legs of lamb, perhaps even a peacock if you wanted to impress. The key was getting the temperature right, and that was all down to experience. There were no thermometers, no fancy dials, just knowing how to build and manage the fire, judging the heat by feel, and constantly basting the meat with its own juices or dripping fat. Now don't think of this as some rustic haphazard affair. Medieval cooks took pride in their roasting. They knew that the quality of the meat reflected directly on them and on the lord they served. Overcooked, dry meat, that was a culinary failure, plain and simple. So they'd baste, they'd turn, they'd season with whatever herbs and spices were available. And these weren't your pre-packaged spice blends, mind you. These were carefully measured combinations, often kept secret and passed down through generations. But it wasn't just about taste. Presentation was key, especially for the lord's table. Think carefully arranged platters, adorned with herbs and edible flowers. Sometimes they'd even reassemble the roasted animal, creating a sort of culinary sculpture. Imagine taking a perfectly roasted peacock and arranging its feathers so it looks like it's still alive and strutting. That took skill, artistry, and a lot of time. But it was all part of the game, a way of showing off the cook's expertise and impressing the guests. And let's not forget the sauces. Medieval cuisine was big on sauces, rich, complex concoctions designed to complement the meat and add another layer of flavor. These sauces were often made with wine, vinegar, spices, and even fruit. Think verjuice, the juice of unripe grapes, spiced wine reductions, or fruit-based chutneys. They were the final flourish, the finishing touch that elevated a simple roast to something truly special. And the importance of presentation extended beyond just the lord's table. Even for the lower ranks of the castle, a well-presented meal was a sign of respect and care. It showed that the kitchen staff valued their work and took pride in feeding everyone, not just the nobility. So there you have it, meat and mastery in the medieval castle kitchen. It was a messy, demanding, and sometimes downright unpleasant job. But it was also a vital one. Without skilled cooks who knew their way around a carcass and a fire, the whole castle would go hungry. And a hungry castle is a very unhappy castle. And remember, this wasn't just about survival. It was about skill, artistry, and a whole lot of pride. Medieval cooks weren't just feeding people. They were creating experiences. They were using their knowledge and expertise to transform simple ingredients into something truly special. And that, my friends, is a skill worth remembering. Alright, settle in folks, let's talk about spices. Now when we think of medieval cooking, it's easy to imagine bland, flavorless food, but that's really not the whole story. You see, the medieval palate wasn't necessarily simple, it was just expensive. And the key to that expense, spices. Imagine a kitchen, not too dissimilar from your own, really, except, well, imagine your entire spice rack, the one that took you years to build, representing a king's ransom. That's what we're talking about here. Spices weren't just about making food taste good, they were a status symbol. They shouted wealth, power, and connection across the table. The more liberally a dish was spiced, the higher the consumer sat in the social pecking order. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of driving a luxury car, except you ate the luxury car. Now, why were they so pricey? Well, think about where these spices came from. We're talking about places like India, Indonesia, and even parts of Africa. These were exotic locales, incredibly far away from your average European castle. Getting these spices involved complex, and often incredibly dangerous, trade routes. Picture this: a spice like pepper, grown in India, would travel by ship across the Indian Ocean, braving monsoons and pirates. It might then be carried overland by camel caravan through the Middle East, facing bandits and harsh desert conditions. Finally, it would arrive at a European port, like Venice or Genoa, where merchants would buy it up and distribute it across the continent. Each leg of this journey added to the cost. Think of the people involved, too. Middlemen, ship captains, caravan leaders, tax collectors, everyone wanted a cut. And the risks: shipwrecks were common, caravans could be raided, and political instability could shut down trade routes at any moment. All of this risk was factored into the price of that tiny little peppercorn. Some spices were valued almost as much as precious metals. Saffron, for instance, derived from the stigmas of the crocus sativus flower, was incredibly labor-intensive to harvest. It took literally thousands of flowers to produce a single ounce of saffron, and each stigma had to be carefully hand-picked. No wonder it was worth more than gold, weight for weight in some periods. And the color, that vibrant yellow, a natural food dye. You knew the meal was special when the saffron came out. Then there's cinnamon and cloves, coming from the Spice Islands' modern-day Indonesia. These were so highly prized that wars were fought over their control. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the English all battled for dominance of these lucrative trade routes. It makes your average supermarket run seem rather tame, doesn't it? So how did this all trickle down to the castle kitchen? Well, the cook became a gatekeeper of sorts. He or she was responsible for managing these precious ingredients, ensuring that they weren't wasted, stolen, or used improperly. This placed the cook in a unique position. Not only did they need to be skilled at preparing food, they also needed to be shrewd managers and perhaps a little bit cunning. A cook who could skillfully use spices to create delicious and impressive dishes could elevate their own status within the castle hierarchy. They became indispensable. Their knowledge of flavor combinations and the proper use of these rare ingredients became a valuable asset, a closely guarded secret. Think of it like a secret family recipe passed down through generations, but for a medieval noble's palate. And it wasn't just about the flavor, spices also masked the less than perfect quality of some ingredients. Let's be honest, refrigeration wasn't exactly a medieval strong suit. A generous dose of cloves could hide the fact that the meat wasn't quite as fresh as it could be. It's not ideal, of course, but resourcefulness was a key part of the job. The use of spices also reflected the cook's knowledge of humoral theory, a popular medical belief at the time. Different spices were believed to have different properties. Some were considered hot and dry, others cold and wet. A skilled cook could use spices to balance the humors in a dish, making it not only delicious but also beneficial to health, according to medieval understanding, at least. And it wasn't just about flavor. Spices meant color too. Presentation was incredibly important. You're trying to impress royalty, after all. A dish that was uniformly brown or gray, unacceptable. Spices like saffron, turmeric, and even alkanet root, used for a reddish hue, could transform a drab meal into a vibrant feast for the eyes. So the next time you sprinkle a little cinnamon on your toast or add a pinch of saffron to your paella, take a moment to appreciate the incredible journey those spices have taken. Think about the trade networks, the risks, the power, and the secrets that they represent. And remember the medieval cook, carefully guarding their precious stash, knowing that the fate of a feast, and perhaps their own status, rested on their skillful use of these rare and valuable ingredients. It adds a little spice to the story, doesn't it? Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to talk about something that might make your stomach churn a little. Medieval kitchens weren't exactly known for their spotless conditions. Hygiene and health were, shall we say, a work in progress. So grab a strong drink and let's dive into the surprisingly gross reality of avoiding contamination and treating kitchen ailments back in a medieval castle. Now, before we get too judgmental, it's important to remember that germ theory wasn't exactly a thing yet. People didn't understand the concept of microscopic organisms causing disease. They might attribute illness to bad air, what they called miasma, imbalances in the body's humors, or even supernatural forces. So when it came to food safety, their methods were, well, let's just say they weren't always effective. Think about it. Running water was a luxury, not a standard. Washing hands frequently, not a common practice. Soap, if they had it, was often harsh and made from animal fat and ashes. So you can imagine the level of cleanliness we're dealing with here. Kitchen staff would often wipe their hands on their aprons that probably hadn't been washed in, well, let's not think about it too much. And then there's the food itself. Meat was a major source of concern. Imagine trying to keep meat fresh without refrigeration. They'd rely on salting, smoking, pickling and drying, which could only do so much. Fly infestations were pretty much unavoidable, and anyone who has ever had to deal with flies buzzing around food knows it is only a matter of time until they land. The only thing worse than flies are their maggots, and all of these preservation methods dramatically altered the taste of the meat, which is why heavily spiced dishes were so popular. It wasn't just about showing off wealth, it was about masking the flavor of slightly questionable ingredients. Dairy products were also risky. Unpasteurized milk could carry all sorts of nasty bacteria. Cheese making was a common way to preserve milk, but again without proper sanitation, contamination was a constant threat. Think of it: wooden tubs, animal rennet, and inconsistent temperatures all contributing to a breeding ground for, well, things you wouldn't want to think about when you were trying to enjoy that cheese. Even grains weren't entirely safe. Improperly stored grain could become moldy or infested with pests. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, was a particularly dangerous contaminant. Consuming ergot-infected grain could lead to ergotism, a horrific disease characterized by hallucinations, convulsions, and even gangrene. So what were the kitchen staff to do? Well, they relied on what they knew. They'd try to inspect food for signs of spoilage, looking for discoloration, foul odors, or unusual textures. They'd use strong spices like garlic, ginger, and cloves, which had some antimicrobial properties, though they probably didn't know why, and they would really hope for the best. But despite their best efforts, illness was a constant presence in the castle kitchen, and it wasn't just food-borne illnesses either. Think about the working conditions: constant exposure to heat from the ovens, the risk of burns and cuts from sharp tools, the heavy lifting, and the lack of proper ventilation. Burns were incredibly common. Splattering hot grease, scalding water, and blazing ovens were all daily hazards. Treatment for burns was often primitive. They might apply cold water or ice, if available, but infections were a major concern. Ointments made from herbs and animal fats were also used, but their effectiveness was questionable. Cuts were another occupational hazard. Knives, cleavers, and other sharp implements were essential for food preparation, but accidents happened. And again, without proper sanitation, even a small cut could quickly become infected. They would often cauterize the wound. That basically meant burning the wound closed. Other common treatments included wrapping the cut in cobwebs or using poultices made of herbs and moldy bread. Respiratory problems were also common thanks to the smoky, poorly ventilated kitchens. Constant exposure to smoke and fumes from the ovens could lead to chronic coughs, bronchitis, and other respiratory ailments. There wasn't much they could do about it, beyond trying to avoid the worst of the smoke and hoping for the best. And then there were the more general illnesses. Colds, flu, and other infectious diseases spread easily in the crowded castle environment. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making people more susceptible to illness. And again, medical care was limited. Herbal remedies, prayer, and bloodletting were the common treatments. So what happened if a kitchen worker got sick? Well, it depended on the severity of the illness and the worker's status. A minor ailment might be treated with home remedies, and the worker would be expected to continue working, perhaps at a reduced capacity. A more serious illness could mean time off, but that also meant no pay. And if the illness was deemed contagious, the worker might be quarantined to prevent the spread of disease. Now, I know this all sounds pretty grim, and well, it was, but it's important to remember that people in the Middle Ages were incredibly resilient. They faced challenges we can barely imagine, and they did their best to cope with them, using the knowledge and resources available to them. And while their understanding of hygiene and health might have been limited, they still managed to produce some incredible food. Just maybe don't think about it too closely. Alright, so picture this. You're humming along in your slightly chaotic castle kitchen, probably dodging a scullion or two, maybe sampling a newly baked pie, and then bam, word arrives like a rogue pot flying off the stove. The king is coming, and not alone. Oh no, he's bringing his entire court. That idyllic image of organized chaos. Yeah, scratch that. Now we're talking real chaos. This isn't just adding a few extra plates to the Lord's table. This is scaling everything up to a degree that makes your head spin, and quite possibly makes the castle's wine cellar weep a little. First, the immediate panic. A royal visit wasn't just a social call. It was a political statement, a show of power, a chance to impress or intimidate the locals, and of course a giant drain on the castle's resources. Think of it like the medieval equivalent of hosting the Super Bowl, but with significantly less plumbing and a higher chance of someone getting poisoned. The existing stores, meticulously gathered and rationed, suddenly look woefully inadequate. Imagine staring into the pantry, usually a source of pride, and seeing emptiness. Not actually empty, of course. There are still those turnips from last fall, and maybe a few precious jars of preserved cherries, but will that impress a king? Probably not. So what do? You start scrambling, immediately. Messengers are dispatched to every surrounding village and farm, essentially placing an emergency order for, well, everything. We're talking livestock, grain, cheese, eggs, vegetables, fruits, whatever anyone can spare. And because desperation is a great bargaining chip for the sellers, you can bet that prices are going to be sky high. But it's not just about the raw ingredients, is it? Now, we need more cooks. A lot more cooks. Every cook, scullion, baker, and brewer for miles around is conscripted, press-ganged if necessary, into service. Imagine the existing kitchen staff, already working dawn till dusk, suddenly being overrun by a horde of, well, varying levels of culinary competence. Some of these newcomers are seasoned professionals, eager to impress and earn a royal commendation. Others are less so. Let's just say a royal visit is not the ideal time for on-the-job training. Then there's the equipment. Are there enough ovens? Enough spits? Enough pots big enough to boil a whole ox? The answer, inevitably, is no. Makeshift ovens are hastily built in the courtyard, fires are stoked to inferno levels, and every available pot and cauldron is pressed into service. The noise alone is deafening, the clatter of pots, the shouting of orders, the constant roar of the fires, and oh, the menu. It has to be spectacular, of course. Forget your usual hearty stews and simple roasts. This calls for elaborate dishes, showcasing the castle's wealth and culinary prowess. Think roasted peacocks adorned with their own feathers, gilded boars' heads, elaborate pastries sculpted into fantastic shapes, and jellies shimmering like jewels. The pressure is immense. Not only are you responsible for feeding a horde, but you're also under intense scrutiny. The king's tasters are out in force, ensuring that every dish is free from poison, or at least doesn't taste suspiciously off. And of course there's the ever-present risk of offending someone important. A poorly cooked dish could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect, with potentially disastrous consequences. It's not just about the food, it's about palace politics served on a silver platter. To manage this culinary onslaught, the head cook, now operating at peak stress levels, becomes a conductor of chaos, assigning tasks, barking orders, settling disputes, and somehow ensuring that everything comes together at the right time. It's a logistical nightmare, requiring the organizational skills of a general and the temperament of a saint, or at least someone with access to a very large bottle of wine. But even with all the frantic activity, some things inevitably fall through the cracks. Supplies run short, tempers fray, and accidents happen. A prized roast might get dropped in the dirt. A crucial ingredient might be misplaced. A scullion, overwhelmed by the pressure, might burst into tears. And through it all, the clock is ticking. The king's arrival is imminent. The pressure mounts. Can they pull it off? Can they create a feast fit for a king despite the chaos, the shortages, and the sheer impossibility of the task? Well, that's for them to try and figure out. We can only watch and see, or, if we were really unlucky, be assigned to peeling turnips until our fingers turn blue. Alright, settle in folks, because even in a place as supposedly rough and tumble as a medieval castle, there was still a concern, albeit a practical one, for reducing waste and helping those less fortunate. Now don't go picturing Robin Hood levels of generosity, but the medieval mind was nothing if not economical, and sometimes, just sometimes, that economy aligned with a bit of charity. So let's talk leftovers. In our modern world, we might toss a slightly wilted salad or a half-eaten plate of, well, whatever it is you're eating. In a medieval castle kitchen, absolutely not. Every single edible scrap was seen as a resource, a potential ingredient for another meal, or sustenance for someone in need. Nothing was wasted. It's a waste not, want not mentality taken to the extreme. Imagine, for instance, a grand feast held in the Lord's Great Hall. Think roasted boar, platters piled high with meats, and enough bread to feed a small village. Now what happens with the uneaten portions? Well, first off, anything untouched, any perfectly good cuts of meat that hadn't been gnawed on, they'd be carefully set aside. These might be repurposed into stews, pies, or hashes for the kitchen staff themselves. Remember, the kitchen staff worked incredibly hard, and while they weren't exactly dining on the Lord's table fare, they still needed to be fed. Utilizing these better quality leftovers was a way to keep them going. But what about the less desirable bits? The bones, the gristle, the slightly past their prime vegetables. Those were destined for the stock pot. Medieval cooks were masters of stock, you see. Every bone, every vegetable peel, every scrap of meat was thrown into a massive cauldron and simmered for hours, creating a rich, flavorful broth that formed the base for countless soups and stews. This stock was essential. It added depth to otherwise bland dishes and provided crucial nutrients, especially during the lean winter months. And then there were the bread scraps. Stale bread, crusts, even the crumbs swept from the table, all were collected. These would be used to thicken sauces, create bread puddings, or, most commonly, to make trenchers. Trenchers, if you're not familiar, were basically thick slices of bread used as plates. You piled your food on top, and after you finished eating, you could either eat the trencher itself, if it had soaked up enough delicious juices, or if it was too hard or too saturated, it was given to the poor or even fed to the dogs. Talk about multi-purpose. Now let's move on to the more philanthropic aspect of all this, feeding the castle's poor. This wasn't always some grand altruistic endeavor, mind you. It was often born out of practicality, a way to keep the poor from starving and potentially causing trouble. A hungry populace is an unhappy populace, and an unhappy populace is far more likely to revolt, or, at the very least, resort to petty theft. Most castles had some form of almsgiving, a designated area, often near the gatehouse, where the poor could come to receive food. This might be daily rations of bread and ale, or a more substantial meal served on certain days of the week, often coinciding with religious holidays. The kitchen played a crucial role in this. Those leftover stocks, those thickened soups full of vegetable scraps and bits of meat, those discarded trenchers, these were all funneled to the poor. It wasn't necessarily the most glamorous fare, but it was sustenance, a way to keep body and soul together. Monasteries located near castles also played a huge role. They were often responsible for the larger scale feeding of the poor. A castle kitchen would often work in partnership with a local monastery, providing the monastery with excess or undesirable foodstuffs that they could incorporate into their charitable activities. It created a network of social support that, while not perfect by today's standards, was certainly a practical necessity. Another form of feeding the poor actually involved the castle staff. Any excess of food would be doled out. It was not uncommon for servants who worked tirelessly each day to receive some type of compensation in food. Often they were allowed to keep any leftovers after the lord had finished his meal. This meant that servants who would often have to scrimp and save were actually able to have a relatively good meal. It's important to remember that this wasn't charity in the modern sense. There weren't necessarily elaborate soup kitchens or carefully planned menus designed to meet specific nutritional needs. It was more about making the most of available resources and preventing outright starvation. It was a system born out of necessity, driven by a combination of economic pragmatism and a sense of social obligation. And while it might not sound particularly appetizing to us today, those leftover stews and discarded trenchers were often the difference between life and death for the poorest members of medieval society. They were a tangible reminder that even in a world of stark inequalities, there was still a place for compassion, albeit a compassion often tinged with a healthy dose of practicality. So next time you consider tossing out those leftovers, maybe take a moment to appreciate the medieval mindset of waste not, want not, and perhaps even consider donating them to a local food bank. You might be surprised at how much good even the smallest scraps can do. Alright, settle in folks, because even in the rugged life of a medieval castle, love found a way. It might not have looked like a modern rom-com, but hearts still fluttered, and families blossomed within those towering stone walls. Now before we dive in, it's important to remember that the lives of kitchen staff were heavily dictated by their social standing. The scullions, the pot washers, they weren't exactly mingling with the nobility. Their dating pool was pretty much confined to other members of the lower staff, stable hands, laundry maids, perhaps a junior guard. Think of it like a very specific, very hierarchical office romance. Courtship, as we understand it, was a bit different back then. There weren't exactly dating apps or fancy restaurants. Instead, young men and women might exchange glances during chores, share a quiet word by the well, or meet at village festivals. Singing, dancing, and storytelling were common forms of entertainment, and opportunities to, well, accidentally brush hands. Think stolen moments and whispered sweet nothings amidst the chaos of the castle. For women working in the kitchens, life could be especially challenging. They were often at the beck and call of senior staff from dawn till dusk. Finding the time and energy for romance was tough. But human nature being what it is, love often bloomed in the most unexpected places. Perhaps a young kitchen maid caught the eye of a sturdy woodcutter, impressed by her skill with a knife or her unwavering work ethic. Or maybe a baker's apprentice found himself smitten with a laundry girl, drawn to her cheerful disposition and the sweet smell of lavender that always seemed to cling to her. Family life, once a couple decided to marry, presented its own set of hurdles. Arranged marriages were not uncommon, especially amongst those seeking to improve their social standing or consolidate resources. However, true love matches did occur, driven by genuine affection and mutual respect. Even if the match was of their own choosing, practicalities reigned supreme. Could they afford their own cottage? Could they support children? Would the lord of the castle approve the union? His permission was often required, as marriage impacted his workforce. He didn't want his best baker suddenly leaving to start a family farm. Marriage often meant sharing cramped quarters within the castle walls, or in a small village dwelling. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Imagine trying to raise children while sharing a room with several other families, all working long hours and dealing with the daily stresses of medieval life. It took a village, because, well, literally, it was a village, crammed into a few rooms. The role of children within the castle community was vital. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household economy. Little ones might help with simple chores, like gathering firewood or tending to the chickens. As they grew older, they'd be apprenticed into trades, often following in their parents' footsteps within the castle. A cook's daughter might become a kitchen maid, a stable boy's son might learn to groom horses. It was a cycle, a tradition, a way of life. Balancing work and family was a constant struggle. Imagine a cook trying to prepare a feast for the Lord while also caring for a sick child, or a laundress rushing back and forth between the washing tubs and her infant's cradle. There were no paid sick days, no parental leave. Life went on, relentlessly. The castle community provided a safety net of sorts. Fellow workers would often pitch in to help those in need. A neighbor might watch the children while a mother was ill, or a group of men might help a widowed woman repair her roof. This sense of camaraderie was essential for survival in a world where resources were scarce and life was fragile. Now, while all this sounds rather practical, even a bit grim, there were moments of genuine joy and affection within these medieval families. Children played games in the castle courtyard, lovers exchanged tender smiles in secret corners, and families gathered around crackling fires to share stories and sing songs. Life may have been hard, but it was also filled with moments of profound connection and simple pleasures. It is worth remembering, too, that not all kitchen staff coupled up in the conventional sense. Some chose to remain single, dedicating their lives to their work or their faith. Others may have formed unconventional relationships, perhaps with same-sex partners, although these unions would have been discreet and often unspoken, given the social norms of the time. Secrecy was the name of the game. There's also the interesting question of inter-staff relationships and power dynamics. A senior cook courting a lowly scullion, that certainly added a layer of complexity. The potential for abuse of power was real, and no doubt, such situations required a delicate dance to navigate, fraught with the ever-present threat of social repercussions. Social standing impacted everything, even love. And of course, let's not forget the impact of childbirth on the lives of female kitchen staff. Pregnancy, while often celebrated, also meant increased vulnerability. Childbirth was dangerous, and even if a woman survived, she faced the challenge of returning to her demanding job while caring for a newborn. There were few options, and the risks were high. In conclusion, love and family life within a medieval castle kitchen weren't exactly a fairy tale, but they were real. They were messy, complicated, and often challenging, but they were also filled with moments of profound connection, unwavering resilience, and the enduring human need for love and companionship. It reminds us that even in the most difficult of circumstances, the human spirit finds a way to flourish, to connect, and to create a life worth living. A slow-burn historical romance, perhaps? I think so. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to explore a side of medieval castle life that's often overlooked, but absolutely essential: the brewmaster's art. Think of it as the castle's very own hydration station and social lubricant all rolled into one. Now, water, while plentiful in some areas, wasn't always the safest thing to drink back then, especially in densely populated places like castles. Sanitation wasn't exactly a medieval strong suit, if you catch my drift. So what did everyone drink? Well, mostly, it was ale. Brewing wasn't just some random chore, it was a crucial skill, often entrusted to a specific member of the kitchen staff, maybe even a dedicated brewmaster, if the castle was big enough. This person wasn't just throwing ingredients together, they were alchemists of refreshment, masters of their craft, and their job wasn't easy. Think about the scale of things. We're talking about hydrating an entire castle's worth of people, from the lord and lady down to the lowliest stable boy. That's a lot of thirsty mouths. So brewing was a constant process, a cycle of preparing ingredients, fermenting, and dispensing, all year round. The basic ingredient, of course, was grain, usually barley. This had to be malted, which meant it was soaked in water to encourage germination, then dried to halt the process. This malting process unlocked the sugars needed for fermentation. The brewmaster would have needed access to large troughs or malting floors and drying kilns to complete this task. This alone was a time-consuming process. Next came the mashing. The malted barley would be crushed and mixed with hot water in a large vessel called a mash tun. This allowed the enzymes in the malt to convert the starches into sugars, creating a sweet liquid known as wort. Now here's where the magic really happened. Fermentation. The wort was transferred to large barrels or vats, and yeast was added. Yeast, those tiny magical organisms, consumed the sugars in the wort and produced alcohol and carbon dioxide. This process could take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, depending on the desired strength and flavor of the ale. But it wasn't just barley ale that the brewmaster was responsible for. Wine was a sign of prestige, often imported from France or other wine-producing regions. But in areas where grapes could be grown, castles might have their own vineyards, and the brewmaster, or perhaps a dedicated vintner, would oversee the winemaking process. This involved crushing the grapes, fermenting the juice, and aging the wine in barrels. Castle-made wine was probably on the weaker side compared to what we are used to today, but it was a delightful treat nonetheless. And let's not forget the other beverages. Mead, a honey-based drink, was another popular option, especially among the nobility. The brewmaster would ferment honey with water and yeast, sometimes adding spices or herbs for flavor. Cider, made from apples, was also common, particularly in regions with apple orchards. But the brewmaster's job wasn't just about making alcoholic beverages. They were also responsible for creating non-alcoholic drinks for children and those who didn't partake in ale or wine. These could include things like spiced milk, fruit juices when available, and small beer, a weak ale with a very low alcohol content. This was often the go-to for children to drink because it was safer than water, but not intoxicating. Now, the brewmaster's work wasn't always smooth sailing. Spoilage was a constant threat. Bacteria could contaminate the brew, turning it sour or undrinkable. Keeping everything clean was essential, but in a medieval castle, hygiene wasn't always top-notch. The brewmaster had to rely on their experience and senses to detect any signs of spoilage. And then there were the ingredients. Availability could vary depending on the season and the castle's location. A good brewmaster knew how to adapt, how to make the best of what they had. They might experiment with different grains, herbs, and spices to create unique and flavorful beverages. Speaking of flavors, while hops are now a staple in beer, they weren't always used in medieval ales. Instead, brewmasters often used a mixture of herbs and spices called groot to flavor their brews. This could include things like yarrow, heather, bog myrtle, and juniper berries. The exact composition of groot varied from region to region, and it gave medieval ales a distinctive, often bitter flavor. The brewmaster's role extended beyond just brewing. They were also responsible for storing and dispensing the beverages. This meant managing the castle's cellars, keeping track of supplies, and ensuring that everyone got their fair share. They might even be responsible for serving the drinks at meals and feasts. And let's not forget the social aspect of the brewmaster's craft. Ale wasn't just a beverage, it was a social lubricant, a way to bring people together. It was consumed at meals, celebrations, and even during work breaks. The brewmaster, in a way, was responsible for keeping the castle's spirits high, literally. The quality of the brewmaster's work could have a significant impact on the castle's morale. A good brew meant happy drinkers, while a bad batch could lead to grumbling and discontent. So the brewmaster was under constant pressure to deliver the goods. And let's not forget, the brewmaster often had a high standing in the kitchen hierarchy, because after all, who wouldn't want to be on good terms with the person who controlled the flow of ale? They often commanded respect, and might even have some influence over other members of the kitchen staff. The brewmaster's art was a complex and demanding one, but it was also an essential part of medieval castle life. These skilled artisans provided the castle with hydration, social lubrication, and a touch of flavor in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. So next time you raise a glass of your favorite beverage, take a moment to think about the medieval brewmasters who toiled away in castle kitchens, keeping everyone's spirits high, one barrel at a time. They really were the unsung heroes of medieval refreshment. Alright, settle in folks, because now we're diving into how all this culinary knowledge, this castle cooking wisdom, was actually passed down through the ages. You see, before the printing press really took off, and definitely before YouTube tutorials, things were a little different. Imagine for a moment you're an apprentice cook. You're surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of a bustling medieval kitchen, but there's no laminated recipe card hanging on the wall. There's no meticulously detailed cookbook propped open on the counter. Instead, your education is almost entirely oral. That's right, it's all about hearing, watching, and remembering. The master cook, or maybe even your fellow cooks, would demonstrate a technique, perhaps the best way to truss a chicken, or the perfect consistency for a bread dough, and you'd have to pay very close attention. You'd watch, mimic, and practice, likely making mistakes along the way. But mistakes in this environment were powerful teachers. Think of it like a culinary game of telephone, but one played out over generations. Recipes, techniques, and tips were all passed down verbally, each cook adding their own little improvements or interpretations along the way. This meant that recipes were often fluid and adaptable, changing subtly from kitchen to kitchen, and even from day to day, depending on available ingredients and the cook's personal preferences. Of course, this also meant that a lot of information could be lost or distorted in translation. A pinch of this might become a handful of that. A precise simmering time might get rounded off. Recipes became less about exact measurements and more about the feel of the ingredients and the experience of the cook. But this oral tradition wasn't just about passing down specific recipes. It was also about transmitting a whole culture of cooking. It was about understanding the seasons, knowing which ingredients were at their peak and when, and how to preserve them for leaner times. It was about understanding the properties of different ingredients, how they interacted with each other, and how to coax the best flavors out of them. It was a complete immersive learning experience, and while the vast majority of culinary knowledge remained oral, there was a slow, almost imperceptible shift happening, the emergence of the written recipe. Now, these weren't cookbooks in the modern sense. We're not talking about glossy, mass-produced volumes with perfectly styled food photography. The early written recipes were more like personal notes, jotted down by cooks for their own reference, or perhaps for their apprentices. These were essentially memory aids, reminders of ingredients and processes. These early culinary writings were often found in household books, alongside medical remedies, gardening tips, and other practical information. They were rarely, if ever, intended for public consumption. Think of them like a medieval cook's personal journal, filled with secrets and hard-won wisdom. These recipes were far from detailed. They often lacked precise measurements, assuming that the reader already possessed a certain level of culinary knowledge. Instructions were often vague and open to interpretation. For example, a recipe might simply say, add spices to taste, or bake until done, leaving it up to the cook to use their judgment and experience to determine the right amount or the appropriate cooking time. Another challenge is deciphering the writing itself. Many of these early recipes were written in Latin or Old English, and often used abbreviations and idiosyncratic spellings that can be difficult to understand today. Plus, handwriting styles varied considerably, making some manuscripts almost illegible. But despite their limitations, these early written recipes offer a fascinating glimpse into the culinary world of the Middle Ages. They provide clues about the ingredients that were available, the techniques that were used, and the dishes that were enjoyed. They show us, in a very tangible way, how food played a central role in medieval life. One of the earliest and most famous examples of a collection of recipes is the Apicius, a Roman cookbook that dates back to the 4th or 5th century AD. While not strictly medieval, it provides a valuable insight into the culinary traditions that would have influenced later medieval cooks. It contains a wide range of recipes, from simple sauces to elaborate meat dishes, and offers a glimpse into the tastes and preferences of the Roman elite. Moving into the medieval period proper, we find collections like the Formi of Cury, an English cookbook from the late 14th century. This manuscript, written in Middle English, contains recipes for a variety of dishes, including meats, fish, sauces, and desserts. It's a valuable source of information about English cuisine during the reign of Richard II. The Forme of Curie is particularly interesting because it provides some details about the techniques used to prepare the dishes, as well as some insights into the social context of food. Another important source is the Viandière, a French cookbook attributed to Guillaume Tirel, also known as Ty Levent, who was a master cook in the service of the French kings. The Viandière is one of the most influential cookbooks of the medieval period, and it provides a comprehensive overview of French cuisine during the 14th century. It contains recipes for a wide range of dishes, from simple stews to elaborate roasts, and offers detailed instructions on how to prepare them. These cookbooks, along with others like them, represent a crucial step in the evolution of culinary knowledge. They marked a shift from a purely oral tradition to a more formal written tradition. They allowed cooks to preserve and transmit their knowledge in a more reliable way, and they helped to standardize recipes and techniques. Now, it's important to remember that these early cookbooks were not widely available. They were typically owned by wealthy individuals or institutions, such as monasteries or royal courts. The vast majority of medieval cooks would have continued to rely on the oral tradition, learning from their mentors and passing on their knowledge to the next generation. But the emergence of written recipes, however limited, laid the foundation for the cookbooks we know and love today. They paved the way for the culinary revolution that would transform European cuisine in the centuries to come. And it all started with a few scribbled notes, a desire to preserve knowledge, and a love of good food. Now, amongst the daily grind of roasting joints and stirring stews, there were moments, precious moments, when the castle kitchen could spread its wings, so to speak. These were the special events, the grand celebrations that broke the monotony and allowed for a touch of culinary artistry, or at least a more elaborate form of the usual fare. Think of it like this: every year there were predictable feasts, Christmas, Easter, maybe a harvest celebration. But then sprinkled throughout were the unpredictable ones: a royal visit, a wedding, the knighting of a local lord, or perhaps the jester's birthday, hence our section title. These were opportunities to show off, to impress, and maybe, just maybe, to sneak in a new recipe that you'd been itching to try. These weren't just about making more food, mind you. Oh no. These were about making different food. The Lord's table might see peacocks instead of chickens, or a whole boar roasted with apples in its mouth. Imagine the chaos in the kitchens as scullions ran about trying to find enough apples that were not rotten. Maybe the cook would try a new sauce, something more complex than the usual vinegar and herbs. Spices, if they could be spared from the Lord's daily meals, might be used a little more liberally, their exotic aroma filling the air and sparking excitement amongst the staff. The preparations for these events often started days, even weeks in advance. Extra hunters would be sent out to bring in game, the fishmonger would be tasked with finding the biggest and freshest catches, and the pantry would be scoured for any forgotten delicacies. It was all hands on deck, from the lowliest scullion to the head cook, everyone playing their part in the upcoming spectacle. Imagine the wedding of the Lord's daughter. This wasn't just feeding the castle's usual inhabitants. This was feeding visiting dignitaries, noble families, and their entourages. The pressure was immense. The cook would be up all night, directing the staff, tasting sauces, making sure everything was just perfect. And if we're being honest, probably sneaking a few sips of ale to calm the nerves. The menu itself would be a carefully planned affair, a reflection of the Lord's wealth and power. There would be multiple courses, each designed to impress. Soups, roasts, pies, tarts, all meticulously arranged and presented. And of course there'd be sweetmeats, marzipan sculptures, sugared almonds, maybe even a candied fruit or two, if there was a master confectioner available. These desserts were symbols of wealth and indulgence, almost as important as the food itself. The jester's feast, while perhaps not as grand as a wedding or royal visit, could be surprisingly liberating. The jester, after all, was allowed to mock, to challenge, and to generally disrupt the established order. This playful spirit often extended to the food. Imagine a pie filled not with meat, but with songbirds that flew out when the crust was cut, causing a flurry of feathers and laughter. Or perhaps a fool's dish, a savory concoction disguised as something sweet, designed to trick the unsuspecting diner. These were opportunities to be creative, to push boundaries, and to show off a sense of humor in the kitchen. This would be a rare treat for the cooks, who mostly had to cook for sustenance rather than flavor. These special events also led to culinary innovation, albeit slow and incremental. Think of the head cook being inspired by a visiting dignitary's description of a dish from a faraway land. Maybe the next day they would ask all the merchants who came to the castle if they had the spices to make this foreign dish. They might try to recreate it, adapting the recipe to the available ingredients and techniques. Or perhaps a scullion, bored with the usual fare, might experiment with a new combination of herbs and spices, accidentally creating a flavor that becomes a castle favorite. The kitchen could even create a new dish on accident when the food was about to spoil but was salvaged by quick thinking. Think of a cook who made a mistake and burned the food on one side but added a new spice to cover the taste of the burnt food. The Lord might even enjoy it. These culinary experiments weren't always successful, of course. There would be dishes that flopped, flavors that clashed, and presentations that fell flat. But even in failure, there was learning. Each mistake was a lesson, a chance to refine and improve. Another thing to think about is how news traveled. Recipes and techniques weren't shared through cookbooks, but through word of mouth. A visiting cook might share a trick or two, or a passing traveler might mention a unique dish they encountered on their journeys. These snippets of information would be eagerly absorbed and passed around the kitchen, slowly shaping and evolving the castle's cuisine. Furthermore, if the castle was at war or went raiding, the cooks might also find new ingredients or recipes if they raided a nearby village. These moments of culinary creativity were vital, not just for the kitchen staff's morale, but also for the castle's reputation. A well-fed guest was a happy guest, and a happy guest was more likely to be a loyal ally. These special events were opportunities to forge alliances, to strengthen bonds, and to showcase the castle's wealth and power, all through the art of cooking. It was a culinary dance, a performance on a grand scale, and the castle kitchen was at the heart of it all. So while the daily grind might have been monotonous and demanding, these special events offered a glimmer of excitement, a chance to break free from routine, and to leave a lasting impression, one delicious dish at a time. Ah, the rumble of war on the horizon. Not the glorious clashes of knights we read about, but something far more inconvenient for the castle cook. A siege. Suddenly, our well-ordered kitchen descends into a world of rationing, resourcefulness, and the gnawing fear of empty bellies. Imagine the news arriving. A messenger, breathless and dusty, announcing that the enemy is approaching. The castle gates slam shut, the portcullis drops with a resounding clang, and instantly our kitchen's purpose shifts. It's no longer about crafting elaborate feasts, it's about stretching every last morsel to keep the garrison, the lord, and the villagers safe within the walls alive. The first order of business, inventory. A frantic stock-taking of everything edible. The larders, usually groaning under the weight of cheeses, salted meats, and dried grains, are now meticulously examined. How many barrels of flour remain? How much salted beef is left hanging in the smokehouse? Are there any hidden caches of nuts or dried fruits? Every crumb counts. The master cook, previously concerned with presentation and taste, now becomes a master of mathematics, calculating how many days' worth of food remains for each person in the castle. Rations are implemented, often drastically reduced. The Lord's table might still see slightly better fare, a necessity to maintain morale and leadership, but even they will notice a significant change in the quantity and variety of food. For the common folk, the daily fare becomes incredibly basic. Think thin gruel made from oats or barley, perhaps with a few root vegetables thrown in if they are available. Meat becomes a rare luxury, a treat doled out sparingly to those performing the hardest labor, like the soldiers manning the walls. Preserving food becomes paramount. Everything must be kept from spoiling, from going bad. Salt, that precious commodity, is used even more liberally, rubbed into every cut of meat to draw out moisture and prevent decay. Smoked meats are hung even higher, closer to the rafters, to ensure they are thoroughly cured. Cheeses are carefully wrapped and stored in cool, dark cellars, hoping to slow the growth of mold. But it's not just about preventing spoilage, it's about finding new ways to make what little food we have last. Bones, normally discarded, are boiled down to make broth, adding a little flavor and sustenance to the meager meals. Stale bread is crumbled and used as a thickener for soups or toasted into hardtack, a biscuit-like substance that can last for months if properly stored. Resourcefulness is key. Every edible plant within the castle walls and immediate surroundings is considered. Dandelions, nettles, and other weeds are gathered and added to soups and stews, providing much-needed vitamins and minerals. Even tree bark, when boiled, can provide a small amount of nourishment. Nothing is wasted. The castle gardens, usually ornamental, now become vital sources of food. Every inch of soil is used to grow vegetables, herbs, and whatever else can be coaxed from the earth. Children are often tasked with guarding these precious plots from birds and other pests. Of course, with scarcity comes temptation. The pantry raid, normally a minor infraction, becomes a serious crime during a siege. Strict measures are put in place to prevent theft, with harsh penalties for those caught hoarding or stealing food. But even with the best planning, supplies dwindle. As the siege drags on, morale begins to plummet. Hunger gnaws at everyone, making them irritable and despondent. The kitchen becomes a focal point of anxiety and resentment. People begin to question the Lord's leadership, the wisdom of the defense, and even their own chances of survival. This is where the cook's role extends beyond simply providing sustenance. It becomes about maintaining morale. Small acts of kindness and creativity can make a huge difference. Perhaps a special herb added to the gruel, a small piece of fruit saved for a child, or a story told to distract from the hunger pangs. Songs and stories become essential tools for boosting spirits. The kitchen staff might sing old ballads while they work, reminding everyone of better times and inspiring hope for the future. The cook might tell tales of legendary heroes who overcame impossible odds, instilling a sense of resilience and determination. Even in the face of starvation, the kitchen can become a place of community. People gather to share stories, offer encouragement, and simply be together. The simple act of sharing a meal, even a meager one, can provide a sense of connection and belonging, reminding everyone that they are not alone in their suffering. The smell of baking bread, even if it's made with substandard flour, can waft through the castle, filling the air with a comforting aroma and providing a momentary escape from the harsh realities of the siege. A small loaf, shared among a group of soldiers, can be a powerful symbol of hope and resilience. Maintaining hygiene becomes crucial during a siege. With limited water, washing becomes a luxury, but every effort must be made to prevent the spread of disease. The kitchen staff is diligent in cleaning utensils and food preparation areas, preventing contamination and minimizing the risk of illness. The cook also needs to be aware of potential food poisoning. Spoiled meat, contaminated water, and improperly prepared herbs can all lead to serious illness, further weakening the besieged population. Careful attention must be paid to every ingredient, and anything suspect must be discarded, no matter how scarce it is. As supplies dwindle and hope fades, the cook becomes a symbol of perseverance. Their ability to create something from nothing, to stretch the meager resources to their absolute limit, inspires others to keep fighting, to keep hoping, to keep surviving. Even in the darkest of times, the kitchen fire continues to burn, a beacon of hope in a world of despair. It's a reminder that even in the face of death, life goes on, and that as long as there is food to share, there is still reason to hope. The master cook is not just a provider of food, they're a guardian of morale, a keeper of hope, a symbol of resilience in a world besieged. Alright, let's settle in for a somewhat somber chapter. We're going to talk about plague, disease, and all the fun stuff that made being a medieval cook even more challenging than it already was. Imagine this, you're working in the castle kitchen, the usual chaos swirling around you, the heat from the ovens making you sweat. But then, the whispers start. Someone's sick, a fever, a cough, maybe those telltale buboes, swollen, painful lumps are appearing. Uh-oh, plague, most commonly the bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, was a recurring nightmare. We're not just talking about the infamous Black Death of the mid-14th century that wiped out a huge portion of Europe. Outbreaks happened all the time, just varying in severity. Think of it as a recurring, awful seasonal flu that could, kill you and half your village. So what happens when plague hits the castle? Well, first, panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. Medical understanding was limited. People didn't grasp the concept of germs or how diseases spread. They might blame miasma, bad air, or divine punishment. This meant their preventative measures were, shall we say, ineffective. Things like carrying sweet-smelling herbs or lighting fires to purify the air. Lovely scents, but ultimately useless against a flea-borne illness. The kitchen, ironically, was a prime location for the disease to take hold. Think about it. Food stores attracting rodents, crowded conditions among the staff, limited hygiene practices. Remember, folks weren't exactly washing their hands every 5 minutes. The kitchen staff would likely be among the first to get sick, and that throws everything into disarray. Suddenly, you're not just dealing with the usual pressures of preparing meals. Now, you're short-staffed. People are too sick to work, or they're terrified of catching the disease themselves. The head cook might be desperately trying to keep things running with a skeleton crew. Imagine trying to prepare a feast for the Lord and his guests with half your cooks down with a deadly illness. Food supplies also become a major concern. Trade routes get disrupted. Villagers are quarantined. Getting enough grain, meat, and other essentials becomes incredibly difficult. Remember our earlier section on food scarcity? Well, plague cranks that up to 11. Suddenly, that pantry raid doesn't seem so bad anymore, does it? It might become the only way to keep yourself alive, let alone the whole castle. One of the cook's biggest worries would be avoiding contamination. Even without knowing about germs, people did notice that sick people contaminated food, so cooks would have to be extra careful, which likely meant completely isolating the sick, which might not be easy or nice. You might think the cook would just leave a sick worker to die alone. The medieval mind valued community, and the church's teachings would pressure people to care for the sick and dying, even at a great personal risk. What happened when a cook got sick? I imagine if he was a low-level employee, he was just left to die. But if he was high enough, say the master cook or the baker, the castle would be in utter chaos. Even a high-level employee would probably be fired or just abandoned as soon as they were of no use. It wasn't a nice time. The lord of the castle, of course, would be in a panic. He would probably pray that he didn't get it. He might order all his servants to pray for deliverance. He might order extreme cleaning of the castle. Of course, none of this would actually do anything, but it would make him feel better. The lord of the castle might have a separate kitchen for him, or order different food. The loss of kitchen staff wasn't just a practical problem, it was an emotional one too. These people were your colleagues, your friends. You lived and worked alongside them every day. Suddenly, they're gone. Death was a much more present part of life back then, but that doesn't make it any easier. The grief, the fear, the constant awareness of your own mortality. It would be incredibly tough to cope with, and through all of this, the kitchen still had to function. People still needed to be fed, the Lord still expected his meals, the castle still had to maintain some semblance of order. So the remaining cooks would have to push through their fear and exhaustion, working longer hours, taking on extra responsibilities. It was a relentless cycle of labor, loss, and the ever-present threat of disease. Talk about stressful work conditions. So plague wasn't just a historical event, it was a lived experience that shaped the lives of everyone in medieval society, including our castle cook. It was a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the constant struggle for survival. And yet, even in the face of such adversity, people found ways to cope, to carry on, to keep the fires burning, both literally and figuratively. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. It makes you think about how lucky we are today, doesn't it? With our modern medicine and understanding of disease, I think I need a cup of tea, and maybe I'll wash my hands again, just in case. Alright, let's talk about moving on up. Our cook, let's call him Thomas, isn't destined to scrub pots forever. In fact, the medieval kitchen, for all its grime and hardship, offered a surprising amount of upward mobility if you were sharp, skilled, and a little bit lucky. This wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder, mind you. It was more like scaling a greasy, very hot, and potentially collapsing siege tower. But the rewards, well, they were worth the climb. So how does Thomas go from being a lowly scullion, basically the human equivalent of a garbage disposal, to say a respected saucier or even gasp the head cook? It all starts with observation. A good scullion doesn't just scrub. He watches. He sees how the master cooks chop vegetables, how the baker kneads dough, how the butcher breaks down a carcass. He pays attention to the timing, the techniques, the little secrets whispered between experienced cooks. And most importantly, he learns to anticipate needs. Is the chopping block getting crowded? Clear it. Is the fire dying down? Add more wood. Is the spice merchant due to arrive? Get the scales ready. Anticipation makes you indispensable. Next up, and this is crucial, is mastering the basics. A saucier can't create a masterpiece if he doesn't know how to make a simple stock. A baker can't bake a royal pie if he can't keep the oven at the right temperature. Thomas needs to become a master of the grunt work, peeling vegetables with lightning speed, perfectly plucking poultry, gutting fish without making a mess. These are the building blocks of culinary greatness. Think of it like learning your scales before you can play a symphony. It might seem boring, but it's essential. And the better you are at these tedious tasks, the more time the higher-ups can spend on more important things, and the more they'll value you. And that leads us to demonstrating initiative. Don't just wait to be told what to do. See a need, fill a need. Did the fishmonger deliver subpar eels? Bring it to the cook's attention, respectfully of course. Is there a new type of herb growing in the castle gardens? Ask if you can experiment with it. Show a genuine interest in the craft. This demonstrates not only competence but also a passion for cooking, which is incredibly valuable in a world where most people see it as just a job. Now, don't overstep. Asking to experiment with rare spices before you can even make a decent broth is a definite no-no, but showing a willingness to learn and contribute goes a long way. As Thomas's skills improve, he might get the chance to specialize. The kitchen hierarchy was pretty rigid, with different roles focused on specific areas. Maybe he shows an aptitude for butchery, a steady hand, and a strong stomach. He could then become a kitchen assistant to the head butcher, learning the art of breaking down different animals, curing meats, and preparing sausages. Or perhaps he has a knack for baking. Then he might become an apprentice to the baker, learning to make bread, pies, and pastries. Specialization is where the real knowledge and the real power lies. And then there's the knowledge itself. Recipes weren't written down very often back then, at least not in the way we think of them today. The culinary knowledge was passed down orally, from master to apprentice, through demonstration and memorization. So Thomas has to listen intently, remember everything, and ask intelligent questions. He's essentially building his own mental cookbook, ingredient by ingredient, technique by technique. And this knowledge is currency. The more he knows, the more valuable he becomes to the kitchen. Now, let's talk about networking, medieval style. The kitchen wasn't just a place of work, it was a social hub, a microcosm of the castle itself. Thomas needs to build relationships with the other members of the kitchen staff, from the pantry man who controls the ingredients to the cellarer who manages the wine. These alliances can be incredibly useful. The pantry man might give him first pick of the best herbs. The cellarer might let him sample the Lord's favorite wine, for research purposes of course. Building trust and camaraderie can open doors and create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Of course, like any workplace, the medieval kitchen had its fair share of politics. There would be rivalries, jealousies, and power struggles. Thomas needs to navigate these treacherous waters carefully. Avoid gossip, stay out of arguments, and always be respectful to his superiors, even if they're challenging. Remember, a good reputation is worth more than gold in a world where your word is your bond. And backstabbing, well, it's never a good look, especially when sharp knives are involved. But all that hard work and dedication can pay off. Maybe the Sosia leaves to take a position at another castle, creating an opening. If Thomas has proven himself to be reliable, skilled, and knowledgeable, he might be next in line for the job. Now he's responsible for creating sauces, gravies, and stews, adding flavor and richness to the Lord's meals. This is a significant step up, with more responsibility, more prestige, and hopefully more pay. With each promotion, Thomas gains more authority within the kitchen. As a socia, he might have apprentices of his own, passing on the knowledge and skills he's acquired. He'll be involved in menu planning, ingredient selection, and quality control. He'll also have more interaction with the other members of the castle staff, the steward, the chamberlain, even the lord himself, and that is where the real influence starts. A skilled cook isn't just a food preparer, he's a food strategist. He understands the lord's tastes, his dietary needs, and the political implications of the meals he serves. A well-prepared feast can impress visiting dignitaries, strengthen alliances, and even influence decisions. A poorly prepared meal, on the other hand, can cause embarrassment, offense, and even political fallout. So as Thomas rises through the ranks, he becomes more than just a cook. He becomes a trusted advisor, a culinary diplomat, a silent power broker in the castle. He understands that food isn't just about sustenance, it's about power, politics, and prestige. And with each perfectly prepared dish, he solidifies his position, his influence, and his legacy within the castle walls. It's a long journey, filled with hard work, challenges, and the ever-present threat of being scalded by boiling lard. But for Thomas, the rewards are worth the effort. He's not just climbing the kitchen ladder, he's carving out a career, a reputation, and a place in history, one delicious dish at a time. And that, my friends, is the sweet taste of success. All right, settle in, friends. Let's whisper our way through some kitchen squabbles, because even amidst the roasting spits and simmering pots of a medieval castle, the drama could be as thick as gravy. You might imagine a medieval kitchen as a place of cheerful camaraderie, a band of merry cooks harmoniously whipping up delightful dishes for their lord. And sometimes it probably was. But more often than not, it was a pressure cooker, a place where ambition simmered, resources were scarce, and the pursuit of culinary perfection could drive even the sanest cook a little, well, flaky. Firstly, let's talk about the pecking order. We've already touched on hierarchy, but let's really dig in. A kitchen scullion might dream of one day becoming the master cook, the culinary overlord of the castle, but that climb was steep and slippery. Every cook above you on that ladder was in a way an obstacle. You weren't just learning from them, you were competing with them. A particularly ambitious sous chef might subtly or not so subtly sabotage a head cook's signature dish, hoping to showcase their own superior skills to the lord and earn a promotion. Imagine the scenario. You're a young, talented cook, bubbling with innovative ideas. You've perfected a new sauce, a tantalizing blend of herbs and spices that could elevate the Lord's roast boar to legendary status. But your superior, the head cook, is a traditionalist, stuck in his ways, fiercely protective of the status quo. He dismisses your sauce as frivolous or unnecessary. What do you do? Do you meekly accept his judgment, burying your culinary brilliance? Or do you risk his wrath, perhaps whispering your recipe to a favored serving maid, hoping it reaches the Lord's ear through unofficial channels? These kinds of power struggles weren't just about personal ambition, they were also about control. Control over the best ingredients, the prime cuts of meat, the freshest herbs. Remember our pantry raids? Well, those weren't just about survival, they were also about strategy. A cook who managed to acquire a particularly rare spice or a succulent pheasant had a distinct advantage over their rivals. Resources were power, and cooks were constantly vying for control of those resources. Competition could also manifest in subtle passive-aggressive ways, spreading rumors about a rival's hygiene, questioning their skills, or even accidentally misplacing their tools were all common tactics. The medieval kitchen was a battlefield of whispered insults and carefully orchestrated mishaps, and the stakes were high. A cook who consistently failed to impress the Lord risked demotion, ridicule, or even dismissal. In a society where your livelihood depended on your culinary skills, that was a serious threat. Beyond personal ambition, there was also the pressure to innovate. Medieval cuisine wasn't static. New ingredients arrived from distant lands, new techniques were developed, and the Lord's tastes were constantly evolving. A cook who couldn't keep up, who refused to experiment, risked becoming obsolete. Think about the arrival of a new spice, perhaps ginger or cloves from the East. Suddenly, everyone wanted these exotic flavors in their dishes. The cook who could master these new ingredients, who could create innovative recipes that showcased their unique qualities, would be hailed as a culinary genius. But the cook who clung to traditional recipes, who dismissed these new flavors as foreign or unnatural, would be left behind in the dust. This pressure to innovate could also lead to some questionable culinary experiments. Medieval cookbooks are full of recipes that sound utterly bizarre to modern ears. Dishes involving ingredients we wouldn't dream of combining, techniques that seem unnecessarily complicated, and flavors that, well, let's just say they probably weren't for everyone. But these experiments were driven by a genuine desire to push the boundaries of cuisine, to create dishes that were both delicious and impressive. And let's not forget the ego factor. Cooks, like artists in any field, were proud of their creations. They wanted their dishes to be admired, appreciated, and remembered. A cook who consistently produced culinary masterpieces, who consistently impressed the Lord and his guests, would develop a reputation, a following. They might even become a local celebrity, their name whispered in awe throughout the castle. But with fame came responsibility, the pressure to maintain that level of excellence, to constantly outdo themselves, could be immense. Imagine the stress of preparing a feast for a royal visit, knowing that your reputation, your livelihood, and even your life could depend on the success of that one meal. The pursuit of perfection in the medieval kitchen was a never-ending quest, a constant battle against the odds. It was a world of workplace drama, competition, culinary ingenuity, and yes, a touch of madness. So next time you're whipping up a simple meal in your modern kitchen, take a moment to appreciate the relative peace and quiet, and maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for the medieval cooks who battled for resources, fought for recognition, and strived for perfection in a world far more challenging than our own. Sleep tight. And so, as our cook, perhaps a little older now, a little wearier perhaps, begins to feel the aches and pains of years spent wrestling with pots and pans, their thoughts naturally turn to the future. Not just their own future, but the future of the kitchen itself, the heart of the castle, where so much of life, both literally and figuratively, is nourished. After all, a cook's legacy isn't measured solely in the flavorful dishes they created or the elaborate feasts they presented. It's also, and perhaps even more importantly, measured in the skills and knowledge they pass on to the next generation. It's about ensuring that the culinary traditions of the castle, the unique flavors and techniques that have been cultivated over decades, even centuries, don't simply disappear when they finally hang up their apron. Think of it, really, as a sacred duty, a responsibility to preserve the culinary heritage of the castle, like an oral history passed down from one generation to the next. These aren't just recipes, are they? They're secrets, tricks, and techniques learned through years of trial and error, whispered from master to apprentice over steaming pots and blazing ovens. They represent the collective wisdom of countless cooks who have come before, each adding their own unique touch, their own little innovation, to the ever-evolving tapestry of the castle's cuisine. So how does our cook, now perhaps elevated to head cook or even master chef, go about ensuring this legacy? The answer, of course, lies in mentoring apprentices, taking those bright-eyed, eager-to-learn scullions, the ones who show a genuine passion for food, and molding them into skilled cooks in their own right. It's a slow process, mind you, a patient process. It starts with the basics, of course, the proper way to chop vegetables, the correct temperature for roasting meat, the subtle art of seasoning. But it goes far beyond mere technical skills. It's about instilling in these young apprentices a deep respect for ingredients, an understanding of the importance of seasonality, and an appreciation for the history and tradition behind each dish. It's about teaching them to taste with their heart, to feel the rhythm of the kitchen, to anticipate the needs of the lord and lady, and to understand the delicate balance between flavor and presentation. And it's also about teaching them patience. The medieval kitchen was not a place for instant gratification. Dishes often required hours, even days of preparation. Apprentices needed to learn to embrace the slow, deliberate pace, to understand that true culinary mastery comes not from speed, but from dedication and attention to detail. More than that, it's about sharing the secrets, those little tricks that elevate a dish from good to truly exceptional. The pinch of spice that adds a touch of magic, the unusual herb that brightens a flavor, the unexpected combination of ingredients that creates a culinary masterpiece. These secrets weren't written down, not usually. They were passed on verbally, demonstrated and practiced until they became second nature. The cook might even share a secret ingredient sauce with a particularly promising apprentice, a patch of wild herbs only they know about, or a special relationship with a local farmer who always sets aside the best produce. And of course, it's about discipline. The kitchen, as we've discussed, could be a chaotic and dangerous place. Apprentices needed to learn to follow instructions, to work efficiently under pressure, and to maintain the highest standards of hygiene and safety. There were no shortcuts, no excuses. Mistakes could have serious consequences, not just for the dish itself, but for the health and well-being of the entire castle. So the cook had to be firm, even strict in their training, always emphasizing the importance of precision, cleanliness, and responsibility. But it's not all about lectures and demonstrations. It's also about creating a supportive and encouraging environment where apprentices feel comfortable asking questions, experimenting with new ideas, and even making mistakes. Because let's be honest, mistakes are inevitable. The important thing is to learn from them, to understand what went wrong, and to avoid repeating the same error in the future. A good mentor doesn't just point out the flaws, they help the apprentice to understand why the flaw occurred and how to correct it. They offer constructive criticism, guidance, and encouragement, always reminding the apprentice that culinary mastery is a journey, not a destination. Our cook might even start encouraging apprentices to develop their own signature dishes, to put their own unique stamp on the castle's cuisine. This not only fosters creativity and innovation, but it also helps the apprentice to feel a sense of ownership and pride in their work. It's about empowering them to become more than just skilled cooks, but true culinary artists, capable of pushing the boundaries of flavor and presentation. And as the apprentices progress, as they demonstrate their skills and dedication, the cook gradually entrusts them with more responsibility. From preparing simple dishes to assisting with elaborate feasts, the apprentices slowly but surely earn their place within the kitchen hierarchy. Eventually, they may even be given the opportunity to oversee a specific section of the kitchen, perhaps the pastry section, the sauce section, or the meat section, allowing them to develop their expertise in a particular area of culinary arts. It's a rewarding process, of course, seeing these young apprentices blossom into skilled cooks, knowing that they are carrying on the traditions of the kitchen, preserving the culinary heritage of the castle. But it's also a bittersweet process, because eventually these apprentices will move on. Some may seek employment in other castles, eager to test their skills in new environments. Others may open their own taverns or cookshops, bringing the flavors of the castle to a wider audience. And some may even rise to become head cooks themselves, training their own apprentices and passing on the knowledge they have gained. And in each of these cases, a little piece of our cook's legacy goes with them. A reminder of the lessons they learned, the skills they acquired, and the values they embraced during their time in the castle kitchen. It's a legacy that extends far beyond the castle walls, influencing the culinary landscape of the entire region, perhaps even the entire kingdom. And that, ultimately, is what it means to be a true culinary master, not just creating delicious food, but inspiring and empowering others to do the same, ensuring that the art of cooking continues to thrive for generations to come. So when our cook finally retires, perhaps to a small cottage with a well-tended garden, they can look back with pride, knowing that their legacy lives on in the skilled hands of those they mentored, and in the flavorful dishes that grace tables throughout the land. A life well spent indeed. Alright, let's gently ease into how things started changing for our medieval cooks. It's a slow burn, not an overnight revolution, but the seeds of culinary advancements were definitely being sown, eventually transforming European cuisine. Think of our castle cook. For generations, their knowledge was mostly inherited, passed down through families and apprenticeships. Recipes, if they even existed in written form, were guarded secrets. But slowly, that was beginning to shift. One of the biggest game changers, new ingredients making their way into Europe. The spice trade, already established, was becoming more consistent and a little less ridiculously expensive for some. We're not talking saffron in every stew, not yet, but things like ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were becoming, well, slightly more accessible, especially in wealthier households. This obviously trickled down to the kitchens preparing food for the lords and ladies. And it wasn't just spices. The Columbian Exchange, that massive exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World, was beginning to have a real impact, although its biggest effects were still a ways off. Think about this. Can you imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes, or Irish cuisine without potatoes? It's almost impossible to fathom, but those ingredients were completely unknown in Europe until the Americas were discovered. It would take time, sometimes centuries, for these new foods to become staples, but the initial encounters were already happening. Explorers were bringing back strange and wonderful things. These things would first be seen as curiosities, maybe even medicines, before someone in a kitchen eventually dared to cook them. And let's not forget about sugar. Sugar was an expensive luxury in the early medieval period, a really expensive luxury. The process of refinement and transportation was arduous. Honey was more common as a sweetener, but even that wasn't always plentiful. As sugar production increased, thanks in part to the growth of plantations in places like the Mediterranean islands, it became slowly, steadily cheaper. Suddenly, it wasn't just for the extremely wealthy. This opened up a whole new world of possibilities for desserts, preserves, and even savory dishes. The sweet and sour combinations that would later define some cuisines started to emerge. Now, it wasn't just what they were cooking with, but how they were cooking. New techniques were also beginning to emerge. The development of improved ovens, for example, even incremental improvements, made a big difference. Better insulation meant more consistent temperatures, which meant better bread, better roasts, and less food getting burned to a crisp on one side. Also, the gradual refinement of cooking utensils and tools was important. A slightly sharper knife, a slightly sturdier pot, a slightly better designed skimmer, these things added up. They made the cook's job just a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient, and efficiency in a busy castle kitchen was everything. But perhaps even more impactful was the slow move from roasting to simmering. Instead of only open-fire roasts, we were seeing the rise of stews, casseroles, and slow-cooked dishes that let cooks experiment and draw more flavor from the ingredients that they already had access to. It was also a time of urbanization. As cities grew, so did markets and trade networks. This created a greater demand for diverse food products and spurred innovation in food production and preservation. So the trend was moving more toward the city, which also drove more advancements in food because of the pressure of demand. Remember, most of these changes happened slowly, over generations. But the late medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance marked a turning point. The rigid culinary traditions of the past were starting to loosen their grip. There was a growing sense of experimentation, a willingness to try new things. Part of this shift was also fueled by the Renaissance itself. The rediscovery of classical texts, including ancient Roman cookbooks, sparked renewed interest in culinary arts. People began to look to the past for inspiration, adapting and refining old recipes. This also coincided with the rise of printed books, which meant that culinary knowledge could be disseminated more widely. Early cookbooks started to appear, although they were still mostly aimed at wealthy households. These changes also mirrored a shift in social structure. While the medieval world was rigidly hierarchical, the Renaissance saw the rise of a new merchant class, wealthy individuals who weren't necessarily nobles by birth, but had the wealth to demand finer things, including finer food. This created a new market for skilled cooks and innovative dishes. Think about it. A wealthy merchant trying to impress his guests with a lavish banquet would be willing to pay for the best ingredients and the most creative cook. This kind of patronage encouraged culinary innovation and elevated the status of cooks themselves. They weren't just servants anymore, they were artists, capable of creating culinary masterpieces. Also, during this shift, the view of food changed from mostly a utility necessity to a status symbol, therefore creating incentive to provide the best food. Now, our castle cook might not have been directly involved in all of these changes. They may have been stuck in a relatively traditional kitchen, still following the old ways. But even in the most remote castle, the winds of change were beginning to blow. New ingredients were arriving, new techniques were being discussed, and the world was slowly, gradually becoming a more interesting place to be a cook. The Renaissance was dawning, and even the kitchen wasn't immune to its influence. This transition wasn't without its challenges, of course. Old habits die hard, and not everyone was eager to embrace new ideas. Some cooks clung to tradition, suspicious of anything that deviated from the established norms. Some lords may have considered new techniques unseemly or overly extravagant. The tension between tradition and innovation was a constant presence in the kitchens of the time. Ultimately, it was a slow, uneven transformation, but the seeds of modern cuisine were definitely being sown. A new era of culinary experimentation was about to begin. And while our medieval cook may not have fully grasped the magnitude of the changes taking place, they were definitely part of it. They were witnesses to a culinary revolution, however gradual, that would transform the way Europeans, and eventually the world, ate. And hopefully, it gave them something new to experiment with while they were doing it. The year is inching towards its close, and a bitter wind whips around the stone walls of the castle. Inside the kitchens, though, the air is thick with a different kind of chill, a simmering discontent that has nothing to do with the winter months. For years, maybe even generations, the kitchen staff have toiled in relative silence, accepting their lot as a given, like the changing of the seasons or the Lord's right to first pick of the feast. But that silence, that acceptance is beginning to crack. You see, life in the medieval kitchen, as we've explored in detail, was hard, brutally hard. We're not talking about a bit of workplace stress here. We're talking about dawn to dusk labor, burns that blistered and never quite healed, a hierarchy that valued obedience over well-being. The occasional scraps from the Lord's table, a lukewarm cup of ale at the end of a long day, that was the compensation. And for a long time, it was enough. Or at least people convinced themselves it was enough. But cracks had begun to appear in that conviction. Whispers started to circulate, quiet grumblings over the uneven distribution of food, the favoritism shown to some cooks over others, the sheer unyielding physical demands of the work. And these whispers, like a slow-burning ember, began to ignite. What lit the fuse, you ask? Well, there wasn't one single event, more of a culmination, a particularly brutal burn suffered by young Alara while tending the roasting spit, a winter where the promised extra rations never materialized, leaving bellies rumbling. The head cook, Master Bartholomeus, publicly dismissing a complaint about spoiled meat as mere whining. Each incident was a drop in the bucket, and that bucket was now dangerously close to overflowing. The first sign of organized dissent came in the form of small acts of defiance, almost imperceptible at first. A delay in delivering the Lord's morning gruel, a slightly over-salted sauce served with the roasted boar, a communal sick day on the day of the annual goose fair. Individually, these incidents could be dismissed as accidents or coincidences, but together they painted a picture of something more deliberate, more organized. And then came the letters. Anonymous, roughly written missives, pinned to the kitchen door under the cover of darkness. They were addressed to Master Bartholomeus, and their message was clear. The kitchen staff demanded fairer treatment, better rations, and a reduction in working hours. They challenged the long-held traditions of the kitchen, questioning the unquestionable. Why, one letter demanded, must we rise before dawn, while the Lord sleeps soundly in his feather bed? Another asked, why does the baker receive a double portion of ale, while we who haul the water and chop the wood go thirsty? These weren't the polished pronouncements of trained revolutionaries. They were the raw, unfiltered complaints of exhausted people who had finally reached their breaking point. Master Bartholomeus, predictably, was furious. He raged and threatened, demanding to know the identities of the traitors responsible for this insubordination. He doubled down on his authority, enforcing stricter rules and harsher punishments. But his efforts were largely ineffective. The discontent had spread too far. The seed of rebellion had taken root too deeply. The kitchen staff, emboldened by their anonymous actions, became more open in their defiance. They began to challenge Master Bartholomeus directly, questioning his orders, pointing out his inconsistencies, and even, on occasion, outright refusing to comply. The kitchen, once a place of quiet obedience, became a battleground of wills, a stage for simmering resentments and open challenges to authority. But this rebellion wasn't just about individual acts of defiance. There was also a growing sense of solidarity, a realization that they were all in this together. The scullions, the pot washers, the cooks, even some of the more senior members of the staff, began to band together, supporting each other, sharing information, and coordinating their actions. They met in secret, late at night, huddled around flickering candles, discussing their grievances and plotting their next moves. One of the key figures in this nascent movement was Agnes, a middle-aged cook known for her quiet demeanor and her unwavering determination. Agnes had worked in the castle kitchen for over 20 years, witnessing firsthand the injustices and the hardships endured by the staff. She wasn't a firebrand or a rabble-rouser. She was simply a pragmatist, someone who believed that things could and should be better. Agnes used her position and her influence to rally the kitchen staff, to encourage them to stand up for their rights, and to remind them that they were not alone. She organized communal meals, where they could share their meager rations and discuss their concerns. She taught the younger staff members basic skills, empowering them to demand better treatment. And she served as a mediator, resolving disputes and ensuring that everyone stayed united in their common cause. The rebellion in the kitchen didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process, marked by small victories and occasional setbacks. But it was a rebellion nonetheless, a challenge to the established order, a demand for fairer treatment and better conditions. And it was a sign that even in the rigidly hierarchical society of the medieval world, change was possible, that even the most downtrodden could find their voice and stand up for their rights. But of course, all rebellions have consequences, and we'll have to see, in the following stories, what those consequences will be for Agnes and the rest of the kitchen staff. Will their demands be met? Will they be punished for their insubordination? Or will their actions spark a wider rebellion, one that could shake the very foundations of the castle itself? Only time will tell. And so, after years of tireless service, our cook finds themselves approaching the end of their tenure within the castle walls. Retirement, as we understand it, wasn't exactly a common concept for medieval commoners. But after decades of dedicated work, a cook might be granted leave, perhaps to live out their days in a small cottage provided by the Lord, or simply to return to their village with a small pension or parting gift. Imagine our protagonist, perhaps a little stooped now from years of bending over hot ovens, carefully packing a small satchel, not with gold or jewels, mind you, but with a few personal belongings, a worn wooden spoon that seemed countless batches of stew, a small pouch of herbs saved from the castle gardens, maybe even a simple hand-stitched book of favorite recipes passed down through generations. These aren't just objects, they're memories, tangible links to a life spent immersed in the world of flavor and sustenance. Leaving the castle kitchen for the last time must be a strange and bittersweet experience. Think of the familiar sounds fading behind them. The clatter of pots, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the roar of the ovens, the boisterous chatter of the kitchen staff. These were the sounds of their life, the soundtrack to their daily existence for so many years. Now, silence. A silence broken only by their own footsteps echoing in the stone corridors. As they pass through the castle gates, perhaps taking one last look at the imposing structure that has been their home and workplace for so long, what thoughts might be swirling through their mind? Perhaps a sense of relief. The relentless pressure of feeding a large household, the dawn-to-dusk labor, the constant heat and stress, all of that is finally behind them. No more demanding lords, no more endless feasts to prepare, no more fear of a spoiled dish incurring the wrath of a hungry noble. A chance to finally rest, to slow down, to enjoy a simpler life. But also, surely, a sense of loss. The kitchen, despite its hardships, was also a place of camaraderie, of shared purpose, of creativity. Our cook has spent countless hours working alongside fellow scullions, bakers, butchers, and brewers. They've forged bonds through shared experiences, through the triumphs of a perfectly executed feast and the disasters of a burnt pie. They've learned from each other, supported each other, and perhaps even bickered like family. Leaving all that behind must feel like leaving a part of themselves behind. And what of the food itself? Our protagonist has dedicated their life to the art of cooking, to transforming simple ingredients into nourishing meals, to bringing joy and satisfaction to others through the power of flavor. They've witnessed the changing seasons reflected in the castle's menu, the abundance of summer feasts contrasting with the scarcity of winter rations. They've mastered the techniques of medieval cuisine, From roasting a whole boar to baking a delicate pie, from brewing a hearty ale to preserving fruits for the long winter months. Do they reflect on the sheer scale of their contribution, the countless meals they've prepared, the thousands of mouths they've fed, the lives they've sustained? Perhaps they never thought of it in such grand terms. For them, it was simply a job, a way to earn a living, to provide for their family. But in reality, they played a vital role in the castle's ecosystem, a silent guardian of its well-being. Without their tireless efforts, the castle's inhabitants would have starved, their health would have deteriorated, and their ability to defend their lands would have been severely compromised. As our cook makes their way back to their village, or to their new cottage, they might find themselves drawn to familiar sights and smells. The scent of wood smoke drifting from a nearby hearth, the sight of a farmer tending his fields, the sound of children playing in the village square. These are the simple pleasures of life, the things they may have taken for granted during their years of service. They might also notice things they hadn't seen before, details that were obscured by the demands of castle life. The vibrant colors of wildflowers blooming in a meadow, the intricate patterns of bark on a tree, the gentle curve of a swallow's wing as it soars through the sky. A newfound appreciation for the natural world, a sense of connection to the rhythms of life beyond the castle walls. Perhaps they'll use their newfound freedom to cultivate their own small garden, growing herbs and vegetables for their own table. Or maybe they'll offer their culinary skills to their neighbors, sharing their recipes and knowledge with the community. They could even mentor younger cooks, passing on the traditions they've learned and ensuring that the art of medieval cuisine continues to thrive. Imagine them sitting by a warm fire on a cold winter evening, sipping a cup of herbal tea and reflecting on their life's work. A life dedicated to food, to the service of others, to the preservation of culinary traditions. A life that may not have been filled with riches or glory, but one that was rich in purpose, in connection, and in the simple satisfaction of a job well done. And perhaps, just perhaps, they'll feel a sense of pride. Pride in their skills, pride in their resilience, and pride in the lasting legacy they've left behind. For even though they may be leaving the castle walls, their influence will continue to be felt in every meal that's prepared, in every recipe that's shared, and in every satisfied stomach that's filled. Their contribution, though often unseen and unacknowledged, has been essential to the life of the castle and the well-being of its inhabitants. And that in itself is a legacy worth celebrating. A life lived in service of others, seasoned with skill and steeped in tradition. A cook's retirement, a quiet ending to a life of dedicated labor, but also a beginning, a chance to reflect, to share, and to find peace in the simple pleasures of life. A life ultimately well lived. And so, as our journey into the heart of a medieval castle kitchen draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating its enduring legacy. It's easy to dismiss medieval food as simplistic or even barbaric when compared to the elaborate culinary landscapes of today. But beneath the surface of roasted meats and coarse bread lies a foundation upon which much of modern cooking is built. It's a legacy woven into our recipes, techniques, and even our understanding of flavor. Think about it. The very concept of regional cuisine, so celebrated today, finds its roots in the medieval world. Before the ease of global transport and readily available ingredients, food was inherently local. What grew in your region, what animals were raised there, determined your diet and in turn shaped culinary traditions passed down through generations. The hearty stews of the colder climates, the olive oil-drenched dishes of the Mediterranean, the spice-laden creations of the East, these regional distinctions, so familiar to us now, were forged in the medieval era out of necessity and availability. They're a testament to the ingenuity of cooks who learned to coax the best flavors from their immediate surroundings.